Hello, everyone. Welcome to the UC National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement's 5th Annual Speech Matters Conference. I'm Michelle Deutschman, the center's executive director, and I'm thrilled that all of you are joining us today for what I know will be informative and dynamic conversations about some of the most critical issues impacting higher education and democracy. One of the things that's changed since I started in my role as executive director 5 years ago is that higher education has been drawn deeper into the culture wars. Instead of being associated with phrases like reasoned debate or access to knowledge, higher education is often said in the same breath as words like indoctrination and partisan. With legislators working to ban books and censor curriculum, the chipping away at tenure protections, and the growing impact of mis and disinformation, there are serious challenges facing colleges and universities around the country. This is compounded by the fact that over the last decade, the American public has increasingly lost confidence in the economic benefits of a college degree. All of this has profound effects on our democratic freedoms, and that will be our focus today, fighting for those freedoms. Before we start, a few program notes. Our fabulous experts are ready to engage with you, so please share your questions by using the Q&A feature. We'll do our best to address as many of them as we can. Additionally, captioners are present in the session to provide real-time captioning services to participants. To enable closed captions, click on the closed caption button and select Show Subtitles to view the captions. We do have one program change. It's sort of like Broadway. Unfortunately, Chancellor Howard Gilman is unable to join us today. Finally, I want to use this opportunity to extend deep and heartfelt gratitude to a number of people. To Brenda Pitcher, the center's executive assistant, who is integral to today and to every center's success. To Melanie Zement, our program associate, who in her first 3 months has rolled up her sleeves and become critical to our team. And of course, to the Glenn Echo Group for all they do to make the center look good, sound good, and be our best. I want to recognize our colleagues in the Chancellor Suite at University of California, Irvine, and at the Office of the President. And finally, I'd like to thank the members of our academic and national advisory boards for their ongoing support. But I reserve the biggest thank you, of course, to the chair of the center, UC President Michael V. Drake. In August of 2020, Dr. Michael V. Drake was appointed the 21st president of the University of California. He oversees UC's world-renowned system of 10 campuses, 6 academic health centers, 3 nationally affiliated labs, and more than 290,000 students and 230,000 faculty and staff. President Drake also holds faculty appointments at the UCSF School of Medicine as a professor of ophthalmology and at the UC Riverside School of Medicine as a professor of medicine. President Drake led the Ohio State University from 2014 through 2020. Prior to OSU, he spent his entire academic career at UC, including 9 years as Chancellor of UC Irvine and 5 years as the system-wide Vice President for Health Affairs. Since taking on his role as the leader of the University of California, President Drake has been an unwavering supporter of the center and our work. It is a privilege to have him join us today to set the stage for our program. Welcome, President Drake.
Well, thank you very much, Michelle. Nice to see you. Good morning, and nice to see everyone. Nice to have all of you with us here this morning. On behalf of the University of California, I'm pleased to welcome you to this year's Speech Matters Conference. And I'd like to thank all of our presenters and panelists today for participating. And thank you to those of you tuning in for these important discussions. Coming together to debate, to learn, and to listen to one another is an essential function of UC's National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement. I'm proud of the university's legacy of knowledge creation and rigorous discourse to serve the public good. At its heart, the function of a public university and society is inseparable from the health of a democracy. Like democracy, discovering, creating, and disseminating new knowledge is an endlessly hopeful endeavor. It can give us faith in the power of humans to continuously work toward a better future and ensuring access and opportunity for all to participate in learning and creating new knowledge. This is critical to a robust democracy led by citizens empowered to choose their own destiny. In a 1967 speech, Martin Luther King Jr. said that power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against love. I think of the love of knowledge, which is at the core of what we do at the University of California. And I think of the love for one another and for a better future that are at the heart of what makes American democracy an endeavor worth our blood, sweat, and tears. History, and even the present, is full of perilous moments for democracy. But there are signs of hope. The nonprofit Freedom House, co-founded in 1941 by Eleanor Roosevelt, reports every year on the global health of democracy. The organization's latest Freedom in the World survey found that the number of countries experiencing declines in democracy last year was the lowest in 17 years. Significant threats to free speech, academic freedom, free and fair elections, and the rule of law, however, still exist. We see them in the newspapers and experience them in one way or another every day. And that's why you are here today, and why the University of California and every institution represented here today is engaged in the pursuit of truth. In 1995, American astronomer Carl Sagan wrote a book that was entitled The Demon-Haunted World: Science as a Candle in the Dark. In it, Sagan wrote about science, like democracy, as the best instrument of knowledge that we have. He wrote, and I quote, "Finding the occasional straw of truth, awash in a great ocean of confusion and bamboozle, requires vigilance, dedication, and courage. But if we don't practice these tough habits of thought, we cannot hope to solve the truly serious problems that face us," end quote. Today, facing an ocean of confusion and misinformation, we will need all the vigilance, dedication, and courage we can summon to face the problems ahead. Thank you for participating today and for renewing your commitment to the democratic endeavor. I hope that the conversation started here today sharpened the tools of critical thinking and the exchange of ideas in service to our democracy. Thank you all very much, and Michelle, over to you.
Thank you so much, President Drake, for joining us and for your moving words. We really appreciate it. It's a great way to launch our day. And now we're going to turn to our first panel, which is going to tackle the heady question of, is social media harming or helping democracy? We are lucky enough to have Jessica Herrera Flanagan as our moderator today. Jessica is an executive with extensive experience working on corporate affairs, public policy, communications, crisis management, government relations, regulatory, legal, and social impact matters in the technology, media, security, sports, and government contracting sectors. She currently serves as the chair of the board of directors of the Center for Safe Sport and as a board member of Regis University and the Peabody Awards. She has served as the vice president of public policy and philanthropy Americas at Twitter and executive vice president of government and corporate affairs at Univision, as well as the president of the Univision Foundation. The center is grateful to have her as a member of our national advisory board. Take it away, Jessica.
Thank you. So, social media and democracy. There's been a lot of dialogue and research on this topic over the years, and talking about the good things that social media has done to further efforts such as the Arab Spring, or to give platforms to underrepresented voices who previously didn't have an ability to share their thoughts and ideas, to the bad of allowing the spread of misinformation to impact civil processes and disrupt societal norms. So what is it? Is it helping or harming? Or is it really that simple? Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by three experts who are leading researchers, advocates, and thought leaders looking at social media and democracy issues, who are going to share their thoughts on the topic. I'd like to welcome Joan Donovan, Jessica Gonzalez, and Jeff Jarvis. We'll get their thoughts on the topic shortly, where they'll tell you a little bit more about themselves. But before we do that, I wanted to do a quick poll of our attendees to get your opinions. If we could launch the poll quickly. So you will see, in your opinion, do you think social media has helped or hurt democracy? Has it helped, hurt, not sure? I don't know, or both. We'll keep it open for a minute or two, and then we'll give you the results and then turn to our experts to see what they think of what our audience has thought, and then give their own thoughts. Okay, 20 more seconds. Okay, let's end it now and see what people thought. So we have 17% have said hurt, 8% have said helped. The majority of people, 72% say both, and 3% not sure. So it looks like our consensus is both. So with that, let's see if our experts agree and what their thoughts may be. Joan, Jessica, and Jeff, in that order, I'm going to turn it over to you to give your opening thoughts on the topic and anything else you might want to share to begin with.
Hey everyone, Joan Donovan here, Research Director at Harvard Kennedy Shorenstein Center for the time being, and good to see Jeff and Jessica, and the other Jessica that I haven't met yet. Thank you for moderating. So I'll keep my remarks brief because I honestly haven't thought about this at all. No, I'm kidding. Some levity here for our conversation, and I know on the West Coast it's very early. I actually am a graduate of the UC system, did my PhD at UC San Diego, and this question of how people participate in democratic societies has been core to my research for the last decade. And I began researching how do people find out information and coordinate using the internet during the Occupy movement and 15M in Spain and other movements that arose in 2011 that were antagonistic to this kind of financial the digitization, in fact, of financial markets that had led to quite a bit of derivatives trading and instability in stock markets that then also had this other effect of creating a mortgage crisis. And of course, there were lots of things that went into creating such a financial crisis in 2008, and then the outcome that we saw in 2011 of these global movements that were looking for massive social change and using the internet to do so. And that's probably where many of you remember and start your both and answer here. Social media's role in democracy is obviously very paradoxical based on the research that we know now, where that social media platforms like Facebook were weaponized by different groups, dangerous organizations, governments to harm populations. We know that Twitter has a paradoxical effect of being able to bring people together around a specific issue. But when political and financial elites use that affordance, usually it's done so in a way to oppress the masses or to shape media agendas. And so the work, of course, that Jeff has done over the years and trying to understand how design impacts, the way in which journalism operates, I think is really important. And then, thinking through what Jessica is likely to talk about related to free press's role in also having to manage this paradox of there are elements that are good for free expression and free speech, but then there's also this other thing that's been happening, which is political elites, well-financed groups, as well as governments have been able to turn the what we might call the affordances or the prospects of social media into massive social vulnerabilities, in the sense that now it is very easy to deliver a payload of disinformation to the public, reaching millions of people instantaneously with claims that the election had been defrauded, or that something nefarious is happening in your local politics. And I think also in terms of your money or your life topics, medical misinformation has become a very important and almost impossible to ignore problem facing our societies. The last thing I'll say about this is there's actually a cost to all of this misinformation. Now, it's one thing to have a few people in a town that believe that the government is corrupt, or that, to believe racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic ideas. But it's another thing for those groups of people to meet each other and get organized using social media, which social media tends to collapse distance and time, which makes these groups able to get organized, able to share resources, and then able to have demonstrated effects from the wires to the weeds, that is moving from online conversation into offline harassment, hate, incitement, and political violence. And when it comes to medical misinformation, that can actually turn into community-wide harms if people do believe that, for instance, that the vaccines have microchips, or they cause certain kinds of illnesses, etc. So we're facing this information crisis, and the cost is being pushed onto civil society. It's being pushed onto our election officials. It's being pushed onto our public health professionals. It's being pushed onto law enforcement to deal with this misinformation at scale. And so some of our research, most recently that's yet to be published, looks at the true cost of misinformation and how many NGOs and nonprofits have had to restructure and retailor their communication strategies on their issues to deal with hoaxing and grift and misinformation. And so it's not the case that all of this free speech is actually free. It's got a cost that is financial, but then there's also a social toll that we all pay. And so not only does the content of our speech matter, but most importantly, that distribution of speech and how we decide what is knowledge and what is not knowledge are imperiled by the design and the structure of social media in this very moment. And then as a trick, I'll give you a second last thing that we have to worry about, which is who owns all of this? Twitter was most recently taken private. That means there's less insight into what's actually happening at the company, less pressure from activist stakeholders, particularly shareholders, in trying to design a platform that is enriching and that has the kind of corporate responsibility to uphold a thriving democracy. We know that YouTube over the years has gone through immense changes to try to serve up news and talk, which is timely, accurate local knowledge, more quickly. There's still a long way to go, but now Google, as well as Facebook, which I'll touch on later, are divesting from that. They're divesting from talk. They're divesting from the ability to deliver important information quickly, especially in moments of crisis, in favor of not researching their platforms anymore. And so I think that those layoffs are indicative of a field-wide challenge related to what are we going to do when fascism is at our doorstep and it's facilitated by the very platforms that we refused to regulate, sanction, or require corporate and consumer protections from. That's all I'll say about that for now. I'm sure I put a lot on the table and interesting to debating some of these issues. Thanks.
Thank you, John. Just a reminder, you can also do Q&A in the corner. So if you have questions, please post them. And in a few minutes, we'll get to some of the questions if we can. I'll turn it over now to Jessica.
Thanks, Jessica. And thanks for that opening there, Joan. It's really nice to be here, especially in a week where I learned that book bans are visiting upon our local school district this week. So I've picked up an unexpected side hustle, unfortunately. But listen, that's not what we're here to talk about today. We're here to talk about social media. And I fall into the both category, unsurprisingly. Social media is a tool. And like a hammer, it can be used to build beautiful things, but it can also be used to crush skulls. We've seen, as Joan alluded to, many social movements benefit from going viral. In the US alone, social media has been harnessed to raise awareness on a range of issues, from police violence to family separation to women's rights, climate justice, and more. It's also helped people participate more fully in our democracy, right? Debating the issues of the day without having to leave our homes, especially during the pandemic, is critically important. But it's also helped us learn from people who are different from us. In short, unfettered access to the internet and the advent of social media fora have lowered the communications barriers for people of color and others who've never been well represented by mainstream media gatekeepers. But there's always a but. There's also a vocal and extreme minority who seek to use social media to crush skulls. That minority is organized, and make no mistake, Joan can tell us better than anyone, the movement is formidable. If we don't stand up to these bullies, I would posit that our democracy is at risk. White supremacists, white nationalists, conspiracy theorists are using social media to sow chaos, normalize bigotry, and undermine democratic institutions. This is a desperate attempt to hold on to power as the United States transitions to a minority-majority country within the next 20 years. No democracy in the history of the world has ever peacefully transitioned to a minority-majority. So the question before us is whether the United States can be the exception. And in particular, what is the role of social media companies who are by and large American corporations? What responsibility do they have? Are the right incentive structures in place to protect the health and well-being of democracy and its adherents? And to the last question, I'd say no. Right now, social media companies profit off selling our attention to advertisers. High engagement content like divisive hate and conspiracy theories keep users glued to their screens. So the incentives here are all wrong. Algorithms feed us content designed to keep us engaged. They micro-target ads and content based on a carefully curated dossier of our demographic and other sensitive data. They're appealing to our interests and, even more cynically, to our vulnerabilities. And the United States has failed to adequately regulate these companies and their exploitation of our private information, which has resulted in human and civil rights abuses. So this is a perfect blueprint for bad actors to exploit. It's why the big lie reached so many people, inspiring the violent assault on our Capitol on January 6th. It's why the Great Replacement theory, the far-right white nationalist conspiracy, continues to be pushed on social media, despite the fact that it's inspired mass shootings on American soil, notably the deadly attack on Latinos at an El Paso Walmart. It's why Black voters have been targeted routinely with messages trying to scare them away from the polls, and why Latinos and Spanish speakers were targeted with lies, discouraging us from participating in the 2020 census. It's also why election workers have resigned en masse following death threats inspired by big lie conspiracies online. So these are really some serious challenges that we're facing, and we have to recognize that if we want democracy in our future, we're going to have to work for it. Social media companies must step up. We, the people, need to pressure them to do so. And especially our policymakers need to act. So we have some ideas because Free Press is a media advocacy organization. We seek to build a media system that serves truth and justice. And we have requests that we're pressuring social media companies to take on, and policymakers too. For the social media companies, they need to heed the best practices set forth by the Change the Terms Coalition. 6 organizations, community groups coming together to say there's 3 things that these companies could do right away to curtail some of these abuses. First is to fix their algorithms. Stop promoting the most incendiary, false, and hateful content. The second is to protect people equally. Staff up, not down, we're going in the wrong direction, to adequately enforce rules across all languages and geographies, and not issuing any special exceptions for the most rich, famous, and powerful amongst us. And 3, show us the receipts. We need a lot more transparency so that researchers like Joan can help us understand the business models and what's happening. And we need Congress and the Federal Trade Commission to enact public policies that prevent bad actors from exploiting social media to violate civil rights and undermine democracy. The Disinformation Defense League, which is another coalition of organizations predominantly led by people of color and women, has issued a policy agenda calling on policymakers to do 4 things. The first is to limit text collection and use of our personal data. The second is to prevent discrimination by algorithms. The third is to force companies to disclose when they learn their products are harming people. And the fourth is to expand Federal Trade Commission oversight and budget so the expert agency can prevent unfair and deceptive practices online. To achieve a flourishing democracy, we must stand up to the bullies who seek to exploit social media and the corporate greed that supercharges them. And I invite all of you to join my organization, Free Press, in this endeavor. Thanks, and I'll turn it back to the other Jessica.
Thank you. And with that, I'll turn it to you, Jeff.
Thank you, Jessica. I'm not worthy to be here. I'm next to Joan, who I learned from tremendously. I greatly admire the work of Free Press, and we have folks from Free Press come in and teach in our engagement journalism program that I teach with Carrie Brown at Newmark. And I'm not a real academic. I'm only a journalism professor. But I'm delighted to be here. And Jessica said much of what I wanted to start off with. So, which is really about how I believe that social media, for all its ills, has expanded democracy. It has brought in communities that were for too long not heard, not represented, and not served in mainstream mass media run by people who look like me, old white men. And so I celebrate that immensely. And so I'll concentrate then, I guess, after Jessica made that point so much more eloquently than I was going to, about media's role in this. And that's about confession, that I think media are screwing up miserably. Neerut Weiss-Blatt, who is a researcher, put a book out called The Techlash not long ago, in which she examined media coverage of the internet over a period of time, and found that she found the moment when it switched from utopian to dystopian. And I think we all saw that happen. It was this admiration for everything Silicon Valley, and then Silicon Valley is the folk devil causing all ills. And that moment in her data was the election of Donald Trump. And my colleagues in media basically wanted somebody to blame and didn't want to take responsibility for our role in media, for what has happened to the country and for the electoral disaster that we had then. And I fault my colleagues in journalism and media for their coverage of the net, because it's been simplistic on both sides. It was simplistically optimistic. Now it's simplistically pessimistic. And it has reached the full point, I think, of moral panic, in which the internet companies are the folk devil. And when we do that, we ignore the underlying causes and the underlying problems that we need to address as a society. And we also ignore media's own role in this. That people spend, last I looked at a study I looked at recently, 5 times more people getting their news from television than from online. All the talk about echo chambers and filter bubbles, I recommend Axel Bruns's book, Are Filter Bubbles Real? A lot of talk about how Michael Bong-Peterson and others have said that the filter bubbles we live in are the ones in our real lives, where we cocoon ourselves, as was said in the Big Sort, into our suburbs and our houses of worship and jobs of like mind. And the internet punctures that bubble that we put around ourselves. It exposes the people that we may already dislike or hate, and it gives us the spitballs from the bad actors to fire at will. And so I think we also have to examine the role in media of amplifying this hate speech, of polarizing us into binary buckets. And let's also, for God's sakes, please recognize the role of Fox News, particularly, and Rupert Murdoch, particularly, in what is happening in the American media ecosystem. I have some FOMA, fear of missing out, FOMO, I should say, for not having gone to ICA last year in Paris, because it was Paris after all. But there was a great session that was run there called "What Comes After Disinformation Studies." I'll be eager to hear Joan's thoughts on that and what's been published in there. But it's interesting to watch the discussion around Lazarsfeld and the idea of how powerful is media occur. Is it all powerful mass media into sheeple, or is it of limited effect and it's really about communities? And that discussion that occurred about media in the 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s is now occurring in parallel about the internet and particularly social media. On the one hand, we want to argue that it is all powerful, and there's a third person effect underway here, which says that everybody else is influenced by this crap. Of course, I'm immune. And on the other hand, it's not seen as powerful at all. And I think that we're trying to grapple with, where does it stand? What is the effect? What do we have? And for that, we need a lot more research and a lot more data to feed that research, so that Joan can keep doing her work wherever she finds the proper and good and wise place that will have her do that. I also recently, a few weeks ago, had the great honor of holding at the Newmark School at CUNY a Black Twitter Summit that was convened by 4 scholars of Black Twitter. We were just lucky enough to be the host, but it really brought into perspective what's going on in terms of the peril that exists for the communities that have built places for themselves apart from white gaze and power that are now imperiled by Elon Musk. And it's easy for me to move to Mastodon and find n number of friends and find fascinating conversations. It's not easy to move a community and its needs and affordances and history, and to be appreciated in a new place. And I think we have to understand what's going on there, that Black Twitter was not by any means just about Black Lives Matter. That was the outcropping of it that enabled a movement to start. It's also about the communities that could exist, about the everyday joy and sorrow, as Andre Brock writes about in Distributed Blackness, that exists there. And so it's more than just democracy per se. It's more than voting per se. It's more than civic information per se. It's more than information per se. It's about the ability, finally, as Jessica said, for communities that were ignored and not served in large mass media to no longer be the mass, to finally be able to communicate and connect in their ways. And I think the institutions we have to date are just not ready for this scale. I'll plug my upcoming book from Bloomsbury in June called The Gutenberg Parenthesis. And one of the anecdotes that I came across in researching that was that the first apparent call for censorship of printing was 1470. Niccolo Perotti was much offended by a bad translation of Pliny and demanded of the Pope, "You must do something about this." Sound familiar? And you must appoint a censor. As I thought about it, I realized he wasn't asking for a censor at all. What he was asking for was the creation of the institutions of editing and publishing to assure quality and credibility and authority in what had become print. And the institutions, those institutions are not up to the job right now, the scale of the conversation we have online. We're going to need new institutions. It's going to take time. There's going to be difficulty between here and there. Bad actors are going to exploit this. We know that, but we need to take time and have time and do it sensibly and sanely and with research and with data. I think we've recognized after the rush of disinformation thought that came after the elections of Trump and Brexit, that the phenomenon that we thought was taking over all of the internet didn't take over all of the internet. It was a certain number of bad actors, and Joan has had the courage of embedding among those bad actors to see how they operate. And it's not a post-truth era. We're not that much different from what we were. It's the hubris of the present tense to think that we're that different. But the problem that I fear in the discussion here is the larger discussion than just this day, is that by making the internet companies into the folk devils, and they're easy targets to make into folk devils because they're not very likable, and by blaming all of our problems on them, and by acting as if we were not already a racist nation filled with inequity and injustice, then we ignore the larger issues in this country. And there's almost a presumption that if we just turned off the internet tomorrow, everything would be okay. And didn't everybody love living under Eisenhower? No, they didn't. And no, Walter Cronkite, it wasn't the way it was to most people. So we have to, I think, bring perspective into the discussion about the platforms and social media and technology. And I fear what's happening at the very moment where we are right now is that the hearing is going on in Washington about TikTok, and a combination of moral panic about technology and about the children, we must do something, and xenophobia about China may lead to the banning of TikTok. But what I see when that occurs is the printing press of, they say 150 million people, fine, discount it. A hell of a lot of people gets torn out of their hands. And that is an issue for freedom of expression and the First Amendment in this country and the value of speech. Because to my mind, the internet became the greater substantiation of the American First Amendment. It is not just about the press as an institution. It is about speech and speech for all. It is also about assembly. It is also about action, about being able to petition grievances, as occurs in the hashtags of Black Lives Matter and Me Too and Occupy Wall Street. And so I fear that what can happen is we are feeding into a frenzy that can occur in Washington, where the speech that allows people who for too long were not heard to be heard is then cut off again, so that the fascists at the door aren't just the Proud Boys. They're the ones already in Washington sitting in Congress today who look like me, who would prefer not to hear from these voices that haven't been heard before. They're not new, and who would prefer to cut them off again and burn the fields rather than share the crops with those who follow. So the greater context here, I think, is about speech and protecting speech, which always means we have to protect bad speech, and we have to grapple with it, and we have to create the institutions to help us ignore it and to not spread it, so we may have good speech. Thanks.
Thank you. I actually want to follow up on your conversation about the need for society to essentially relearn how we talk to ourselves, you know, looking back on the printing press all the way up. How do we do that? I mean, the business, I know you've written on this, and I'm sure I don't want you to give away anything that's coming out in the book, but how do we rebuild the business models for media and technology? Right now, it's very much based on, I think, as you have said, value over volume, relationships over attention. How do we start to do that in an effective way and basically tear down institutions that are already there?
Thanks for that question. As I worked on the book, I think I saw a change come. This is fairly obvious, but at the moment of the mechanization and industrialization of print, the steam-powered press and the linotype and cheap paper and so on, that before that, print was greatly conversational. It was Erasmus having a conversation with Moore through their books, and Luther having a conversation with the Pope through bonfires of their books, and so on. The conversation ended with mass media. The conversation ended with this industrialization. Before that moment, before 1800 and steam power and cheap paper and eventually the linotype came in, the average circulation of a daily newspaper in the United States was 4,000. It was a Substack newsletter. The scale was entirely different. The scale of Free Press works with tons of smaller organizations that are rebuilding journalism in their communities in new ways. But I think our expectation is that success is only measured in terms of mass and high scale and big money and investment. And it doesn't need to be like that. Right before this, I spoke to our 6th cohort of our new entrepreneurial program, where there's 20 people who are going to build very small businesses, and they're going to serve communities and markets in new ways. And they're going to do it through every damn business model and revenue stream they can get, not just subscription and advertising, but also membership and events and patronage and other ways. And we're going to try to have to rebuild. And as Clay Shirky says, it's going to be a mess between here and there, but I think we'll get there. Last point. It took 150 years after movable type And again, to make clear, movable type started in Korea and China before that, but in the Western narrative, 150 years after Gutenberg, before we saw a huge rush of innovation in print, with print. That is to say, the invention of the modern novel with Cervantes, the invention of the essay with Montaigne, the invention of a market for printed plays with Shakespeare, and the invention of the newspaper. 150 years. We're in the very early days. It was another century before we got a business model for this in the guise of copyright and the model of property. So I think it's gonna take time.
I might just jump in. That was great, Jeff. Thank you so much. It's an important question. From Free Press's view, we can't rely on capital alone to get us to meet the information needs of our communities. We see, I think you're right, absolutely right, Jeff, that most people, when you ask them about their most trusted source of news, it's their local TV stations. I think that's the most recent Pew data shows us that, right? And yet, so many of us are lacking the information that we need to make good decisions about what to do in our daily lives, and especially folks non-English languages and non-white communities. I was just in Washington a couple of weeks ago, and we brought some members of the Disinfo Defense League to Congress to talk about how they were meeting their community's information needs. And this organization, PhilPro, is a Filipino organization that saw during the pandemic that their communities weren't getting the information. They were being bombarded with false information in English and in Filipino, encouraging them to not get the vaccine, and getting all sorts of medical disinformation aimed at a community that is largely like a huge caregiving community and very abundant in the medical field. And they actually talked about this project that they stood up as a nonprofit to serve their community's information needs. They got, I think, some state funding, a little bit of foundation funding to make sure that they were actually, pushing back on the false narratives that were being targeted at their community and rebuilding something new. I mean, we're seeing, like in New Jersey, for instance, we have a Civic Info Consortium that's giving out money every year to local, sometimes public, sometimes private institutions that are very focused on what are the public interest, public needs of our communities. And so we actually have to rethink and redesign and invest. Like I said, democracy's at stake, and we actually have to invest in local news. State of California, right, just set aside $25 million that went to UC Berkeley that's going to be funding journalism fellows to help bolster journalism and meeting information needs in our state. These are the type of projects that are really interesting and exciting to me, and very small in scale, but we're going to learn a lot. And I hope we're going to be able to scale up and not have to rely on capital, because what we've seen is that the wrong incentive structures are in place. Outrageous content gets eyeballs, that gets ratings for TV, it gets clicks and engagement in social media, and it's not always the right incentive structures to serve people quality local news.
Thank you. I'm actually going to ask both of you, since we're on this topic, two questions that have come in from our audience. One is, yes, the organizations and institutions are very important, but as we've seen with the bank failures, isn't it even more critical that the individuals who populate these organizations right now are lacking in the competence and judgment to identify, analyze, and promulgate guidance, policy, and directives? What do we do about that? And then sort of the flip side, that's looking at the creators of that, but looking at the users. Has the level of public tolerance for complexity and ambiguity in the news and the like changed enough given the rising educational attainment? Should that be a part of the calculus we see here?
I might just say is this about the individuals? I mean, maybe if we're talking about the individual at the top. I think I'm much more concerned about the systems rather than the individuals and the incentive structures that are in place when we expect capital to support a healthy information ecosystem.
I'll respond to, I guess, it's Michael's question here about the institutions. Speaking out of school, literally, one dream of mine that I'm not going to realize before I retire is I wanted to start another degree in internet studies at the school. I want to expand the canvas upon which we work past this narrow idea of media and content and publications to the larger campus. My current school doesn't want to do that, so I'm not going to do that. I'm going to try to figure out some other means to do that. But I think it is important that we study this at the larger scale in exactly that way, where we empower companies and policymakers and politicians and media people to ask the larger questions about the ethics and history and sociology and anthropology of what we are building here and what we're doing with it and how we do it, to bring in these other disciplines into the conversation and into the study, and to use this research to do that. I think that's vital, because now I think we're still doing it in little pieces here, where media sees, everybody is the blind people and the elephant, and we in media see this as a medium, and it's not. Media is a subset. Commerce is a subset. Crime is a subset. Education is a subset of this new connected world that we have to understand better.
I just want to add and riff on Jeff's point here about institutions standing up to what's happening here. My research lab, in conjunction with the Public Interest Tech Lab at Harvard, made a strategic decision that we're going to publish the Facebook leaks and the Haugen leaks, particularly because of the value to not just journalists and researchers who should have access to these documents for what they may reveal within context, but also because we do need a more structured internet studies field. And we need internet history and the archives of these conversations. I was recently at South by Southwest and talking with Brittany Kaiser, who was the business director at Cambridge Analytica during the Bannon days, and learning from her about the ways in which Facebook really supported that kind of research on their platform that led to this targeting that Jessica was talking about, groups that were spun up on Facebook to dissuade people from voting, and data that was taken to target lookalike audiences in particular. And so I do think that the field of internet studies, and I'm if you want to learn more about it, there's the Association of Internet Researchers that's been going for some time now, really does blend technology and technologists with social science, sociology in particular, philosophy, comms departments. And it's been a relatively generative environment to discuss these bigger picture questions. So what are those bigger picture questions, though, are really important ones to identify, because by the time you get down to the level of user-generated content and individual speech, you have actually passed through many layers of the technological onion. They call it the tech stack, and you've gone through domain registrars, ISP, or internet service providers. You've gone through content delivery networks. So in order to access and distribute information, there's this whole arena that we need to explore. And then, of course, we have to ask the question, well, what is social media anyway? Does it resemble products that we already have regulated? How does it make its money? For whom is considered a user? For whom is considered a customer? And I've come to the conclusion and the realization through reading copious amounts of research, including Sophia Noble's book, Algorithms of Oppression, that most of what we're talking about is built on a backbone of advertising. And if you think about a technology like Twitter, there's really no difference between a post and an advertisement, other than the advertisement has been paid for and they have delimited what content they want delivered to what audience. Now, there's many ways to do this. There's many ways to have advertising on platforms, But once advertising is placed directly into news feeds and timelines, and it is shaped primarily to look like other forms of content, we're dealing with something different. Now, I know for years, many through the work of Caroline Jack, who's at UC San Diego, advertisers do argue that they have free speech and that they should be able to do what they want to do. But based on my conversations with Cambridge Analytica folks and whatnot, those arguments are used as a way to do politics by other means. And the way in which you would collect advertising data is the same way you would collect political data. And so it's really important for us to think about, at this stage, know your customer laws, as well as consumer protection laws. And if we could, reverse the trend in tech so that they actually enforced the protections they promised to users in the terms of service, we'd be in a much more different place. Now, who is abusing these platforms? Routinely, and Kate Starbird's lab points this out at UW, the repeat offenders are largely people who are very wealthy, already well connected, and aren't necessarily just these anonymous trolls that tend to have sort of a heightened reputation in this field. That being said, I'm very interested in seeing what comes out of the trial of Douglas Mackey, who went as Ricky Vaughn online, who was coordinating sending out election misinformation, specifically about trying to get people to vote on the wrong day in 2018. That is a crime, right? It's more than memes. And the last point I'll say on this, related to memes and the kind of communication that is quite ambiguous right now. So the book Meme Wars I wrote with colleagues Emily Dreyfus and Brian Friedberg, and the point of Meme Wars was largely to tell this story of participation online and how different constituent groups are able to mobilize and are able to take action and are able to have their political voices known. But the story that we tell is largely of groups of people who were using the affordances and the openness of social media in order to deliver this kind of misinformation through mimetic warfare. And we go all the way from Occupy to the insurrection to talk about folks like Steve Bannon, Andrew Breitbart, Alex Jones, and then we get into the foment of MAGA and the alt-right through Richard Spencer, Milo Yiannopoulos, Baked Alaska. And so the same things that Jeff is arguing as a virtue that allowed fringe left movements to become socially impactful is the same mechanisms that are allowing for hate, harassment, and incitement to scale in our society. So it's not the case that we can have content neutral or content ambiguous policies and focus solely on design, because that can't solve the issues that we're facing with the way that social media helps to scale disinformation, medical misinformation, and even these very dangerous and violent political groups.
John, I'm glad you mentioned the Meme Wars, because I actually wanted to ask you about that, and kind of touching upon the points you made a second ago, because in the book, you discussed the weaponization of memes. And one of the defenses that we often see is, one, there are different ways of communicating. Words can mean different things. Pictures can mean different things to different people. One of the defenses oftentimes you saw with memes is it's an inside joke. It's a silly thing. You're misunderstanding what we're saying. At the same time, there's this question of who really, you said things can't be content neutral, but who gets to decide that? When, what do you think is the intent of, and I'm combining a couple of questions people had here. So what do you think is the intent of what is perceived as misinformation? Is it always bad actors, groups? What if they really believe they're providing accurate information? How do we discern?
Zuckerberg answered this question in an interview with Kara Swisher, where he said, well, we're going to allow anti-Semitic content. This isn't a direct quote, but because people might actually believe the Holocaust didn't happen. And so if they believe that, who are we to judge? And my, response to a statement like that is, you're providing a broadcast platform to millions of people. It's your responsibility to make sure the information that is swirling about in your technology is, correct, or at least within the bounds of what we would consider debatable even. And so we know content that is hate, harassment, and incitement that moves through a platform like Facebook is something that their algorithms are also helping to spread. This is clearly noted in the congressional testimony of Frances Haugen, as well as in the Wall Street Journal, around research that Facebook did about itself related to how fast do people get conspiracy content once they've signaled an interest. So typing in what is QAnon, right, and then getting content about it, realizing this isn't for me, the algorithms are going to keep showing you that. And a lot of this has to do with the design and structure of recommendation systems, as well as what are called reinforcement algorithms, which are designed to kind of keep you coming back to that content that they think you might like. And so it's not an arbitrary thing that their platforms are promoting this content, that their platforms are allowing for the dissemination to millions and millions of people, this kind of content that does misrepresent itself on purpose. And we wouldn't allow that from other institutions like our newspapers, like our radio, like our television. And so we have to really ask those questions and ensure that the technology's design is in alignment with its capacity to produce consumer safety. And the last example I give is you'd never allow an airplane manufacturer to build airplanes, put consumers on them, and fly them around without airports. At one point we did, right? But things change. And we have years now, decades of social media to help us design and fortify an internet in the public interest, and help us to design how these programs and software can work better. And the last point I'll say on that is the money that these billionaires are not putting back into these platforms, they're putting into other political projects. And so it's very important that we understand that Zuckerberg's investment, for instance, in the future of AI landed a $500 million investment in Harvard, right? Because Zuckerberg wants to shape the future of AI. And he's going to do that by aligning with very powerful institutions. And never once have they mentioned, we really care about the ethics of AI, right? And so when you look at how these fields develop, about how they pivot their political influence quickly out of the product that is causing so many social costs and financial costs and into other political endeavors, we do have to worry about the future of our democracy, of journalism, of our military who's going to be using these AI products. And it's going to be critical that we have regulation around the entire tech stack that ensures the safety of, people who are using the internet, as well as, I hesitate to say you could opt out at this point because I don't think you can.
Yeah, well, thank you. We actually are out of time, and there were so many other questions that I had and others had, but I'm going to hopefully I don't get in too much trouble. I'm going to ask you all one question, answer it either help or hurt. So there was a question, since you mentioned AI, I'm going to take the privilege of asking an AI question. is AI going to help or hurt all of the things we talked about in the long run? Help, hurt, or unknown at this point? So I'll start with you, Joan, and then go to Jessica and then Jeff.
I think that there's incredible medical uses for AI, especially the advancements in algorithms that can read test results at a more granular level than the human eye. And so I think that there are many important uses. Even I look forward to a day when I can watch a foreign movie and not have to deal with dubbing and whatnot. It'd be great if actors' faces made the movements that the words I wanted to hear were coming out. So I'm excited about some of the creativity and the possibility, but I am not excited by the hype around generative AI at this point. That is things like ChatGPT or whatnot that don't take into account all of the labor that has gone into producing the text that it is plagiarizing from. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Jessica?
I'll give you the lawyer's answer. It depends, right? It depends on what kind of incentive structures and accountability mechanisms we have in place.
Thank you. And Jeff?
I'll go back to Montaigne. I think that when he invented the essay, he raised the bar for entering public discourse very high to become a writer and to write. And I think that what these things do potentially is open up literacy in new ways. I know our international students use these tools to be able to code switch their English for us English professors and so on. What's upsetting me, as Joan just said, is the hype is way off. I think that Emily Bender is brilliant on this stuff. The Stochastic Parrots Day was last Friday when they talked about their original paper. Microsoft and Google should not be using large language models for search. They don't know facts. They don't understand anything. They know that's the case. Why the hell are they doing this? And media are being effing idiots about this. No, Kevin Roos of the New York Times, the machine did not want to fall in love with you and break up your marriage. And the fact that you couldn't sleep at night should be about the quality of your effing journalism in mal expressing what this technology can and cannot do and what we should expect from it. And it's an example of the moral panic and idiocy of my colleagues who are going to, on the one hand, overhype this stuff so that it gets used in the wrong places and they create a race between Microsoft and Google. And on the other hand, get stupid congressional regulators to come in and regulate the wrong things.
Thank you. And thank you to all our guests with the first name that starts with J. I just realized that as I'm looking at them.
You just stole my line.
Oh, I'm so sorry. But I will ask the panelists, there are Q&As that we did not get to. If y'all could take a look, and if you'd like to answer one or two in written answers, that would be great. And we'll try to get through some of those because I know that I see at least 10 still there. So maybe we can knock some of those out. And I'll hand it back to you, Michelle.
Well, I of course want to thank you, Jessica, for moderating, and Jessica and Jeff and Joan for joining. Obviously, we could spend the entire time talking about this issue. I'm grateful to you for your time and expertise. And we're going to move forward and talk a little bit about our fellows program. As many of you know, one of the cornerstones of the center is our National Fellows Program. We select fellows each year from a broad range of disciplines and backgrounds. Fellows receive funding to conduct research that furthers the national conversation related to expression and democratic participation on college campuses. Our current class of fellows is an impressive group, and this video will explain why. And then when I come back, we'll be hearing about the Supreme Court docket from Dean Erwin Chemerinsky. Each year, the Center selects fellows from a broad range of disciplines and backgrounds, such as law, journalism, higher education, technology, and government. Fellows receive funding to further the national conversation related to expression and democratic participation on college campuses. Their projects have a direct impact on individuals and communities across campus and are focused on enhancing our understanding of how free speech is and can be practiced in American higher education, as well as how to foster civic engagement in university life. We are excited to present their work to you early this summer, followed by a series of interactive Fellows in the Field digital workshops. In the meantime, let's hear from them about their projects and why these issues are so important to their scholarship.
My project is an evolution of some work that we have been doing for several years. And so one of the concerns that we have had in relationship to our democracy is the inability for folks to talk across difference. And so because of that, we have done extensive work around civil discourse and dialogue. In the course of that work, it has become more apparent that one of the things that is hindering our ability to talk is the lack of appreciation of expertise, of facts, and really a lot of mis and disinformation. So with my project, my goal is to explore this idea of how can we disrupt mis and disinformation in higher education, both in the classroom and outside of the classroom in co-curricular settings.
We're really at a moment of great polarization in the United States, and a lot of this polarization plays out, and these tensions play out in virtual environments and social media. Our colleges and universities are some of the key areas that we're hoping to build a way to further a participatory democracy where we can engage in debates and discourse, but in a way that we elevate the conversation and what we're talking about, and also that we find ways to lessen harm to others. It's really something that we're grappling with as a nation.
So one of the things that drew me to the center is that it is probably the only place that I can actually come and do my passion project, which actually focuses on free speech as it centers around Black women and their role in the academia. My project is specifically around whose speech is protected, specifically looking at Black women, because oftentimes on campus, Black women are oftentimes seen through racialized lenses. So I want to look at when a Black person, faculty, staff, or student says something on campus, how are they received and perceived by folks around them?
Why should people care about academic freedom and free expression when it comes to democracy? What is the connection between these values and a healthy, functioning democracy, which is under threat right now in the US? And this center and this opportunity really gave us a chance to dig into what's happening and track it in real time in terms of the impact of these divisive concept bills on academic freedom in higher education.
We're also particularly interested in using this fellowship as an opportunity to talk to our faculty colleagues and the broader public of engaged citizens in the United States, engaged people in the United States, about why does academic freedom matter? Why does free expression matter?
So my project really focuses on understanding how students in particular navigate difficult classroom conversations, how they think about what other students say, and how they think about their own speech in the classroom, particularly when classroom conversations veer into areas where people might say something that could be offensive to someone else in the class. How do we help students engage with each other across these really contentious issues in more productive, constructive ways?
I'm an art historian, and I'm looking at public artworks across college and university campuses, and really looking at them as works of art, sculptures, murals, temporary performances, printed material, installed in public places on these campuses.
Part of what the research will be looking at is how bias response teams work. You know, there's been a lot of legislation that has actually modified or necessitated modification of how those teams operate. So we're looking at bias response teams, we're looking at deans of students, we're looking at really just universities in general, how, one, they're preparing the population for free speech and what it means to be a part of this community. But then two, when incidents do happen, how best to respond to those incidents and make sure that we're both protecting free speech, but really attempting to address the harm that was done while creating the climate and culture that we hope for as universities.
For my project, I'll be doing archival research about UC student advocacy movements throughout the course of the UC's history. As the first undergraduate fellow, I'm hoping to really bring student perspectives and the importance of students involved in research to the center. The UC system is known for being a research institution. I'm hoping that having students involved in research and being the first student involved in research at the center will help show the importance of students and their perspectives in creating policies, in navigating advocacy, and in the broader UC picture.
My project builds upon prior research on repressive legalism, and it looks at how faculty are understanding and responding to current external political and legal pressures that restrict the teaching of anything related to equity and inclusion in the classroom. And so as part of my project, I'm conducting a single site instrumental case study that looks at one particular public institution within a politically polarized state.
One of my favorite things about the fellowship and my involvement with the center is getting to meet the other fellows.
It's really exciting getting to work with, have conversations with people who are thinking about the same issues I am, but thinking about them from these sort of like different disciplinary perspectives, these different life experience perspectives. I think we all do our best work when we're in conversation with others.
So when I first learned about the center and the fellowship program, I was really drawn to it because it seemed to be a unique organization within this broader landscape of higher ed free speech organizations. In particular, that it's based in an academic institution and the focus is really on understanding these issues in a deep way.
What drew me to the Center's Fellows program was really an opportunity just to think critically and deeply about a problem of practice, something that, I encounter in my work that I find compelling and interesting, challenging, but really space to be able to invest time and really think about it deeply with a really talented colleague and hopefully come up with some good answers.
I would just say that I am passionate about our democracy, and it is a powerful country, concepts, everything around what we're trying to do in a multicultural democracy with our society. And I really am hopeful that the work that the center does, that our fellows are doing to talk about free speech, academic freedom, things that are critical to a successful democracy or a flourishing democracy.
To learn more about the center and the work of our fellows, visit us at freespeechcenter.universityofcalifornia.edu. Hi, I'm back. It's a great group. I'm excited about their cutting edge research, and you'll get to hear from two of them when we turn to our academic freedom panel. But first, let's consider a government entity that has tremendous impact on individuals and societal freedoms, and that is the Supreme Court. And who better to learn about the Supreme Court from than the Dean of Berkeley Law and preeminent constitutional scholar, Erwin Chemerinsky. Prior to becoming the 13th Dean of Berkeley Law, he was the founding dean at University of California Irvine School of Law. Before that, he taught at Duke, and prior to that, at the University of Southern California, where I was lucky enough to be a student in his Con Law 1 and Con Law 2 classes in 2001 and 2000. Yes, I'm giving away my age. He is one of the two terrific co-chairs of the Center's National Advisory Board and is here today to talk to us about some cases on the Supreme Court's docket that will surely impact speech, engagement, and ultimately democracy. And I'm going to thank you, Dean Chemerinsky, and turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. Thank you for involving me in this wonderful Speech Matters conference. And Michelle, thank you and congratulations for all you've done for this conference and for the center. Michelle asked me to talk for a few minutes about some of the cases before the Supreme Court that are likely to affect college universities. I'm going to start with a couple of speech cases. One is 303 Creative versus Elenis, was argued on Monday, December 5th. Lori Smith has a business running and putting together websites. She decided she wanted to expand and do websites for weddings, but she said because of religious beliefs, she didn't want to do websites for same-sex weddings. Colorado has a law that prohibits business establishments from discriminating on the basis of race, sex, religion, sexual orientation. Lori Smith filed a lawsuit in federal district court seeking a declaratory judgment that it would be unconstitutional to apply the Colorado law to her because of religious beliefs and also because of freedom of speech. The Federal District Court in Denver and the 10th Circuit ruled against Smith. These courts said that Colorado has a compelling interest in stopping discrimination by business establishments on grounds of sexual orientation. Lori Smith sought Supreme Court review. Interestingly, while she asked the court to review both the speech and the religion questions, the Supreme Court took up only the speech issue. And the question is, would forcing her to design websites for same-sex weddings be impermissible compelled speech? Colorado says this is conduct, not speech. And besides, the state has a compelling interest in stopping discrimination. Based on the oral arguments, I think the conventional wisdom is that the Supreme Court's going to rule in favor of Lori Smith. A great deal is going to depend on how it chooses to write that opinion. It's clear that religion very much underlies her claim. How will the court cabin this? Will an interracial couple be denied the ability to rent property if a landlord says doing so is against my religious beliefs? What of the employer who says that it's against my religious beliefs to have men and women in the same workplace, and therefore says not going to hire women? There's always a tension between liberty and equality. Any law that prohibits discrimination limits the freedom to discriminate. For a half century, the Supreme Court has emphasized stopping discrimination and refused to recognize freedom to discriminate. I think this case is going to change that, going to have major implications. Second speech case I wanted to mention is Counterman versus Colorado. The issue here is, what's a true threat that's unprotected by the First Amendment? In United States versus Watts in 1969, the Supreme Court held that, quote, true threats are not speech protected by the First Amendment. That was a case that involved a federal law that made it a federal crime to threaten the president of the United States. And the Supreme Court upheld the law, but the court emphasized it's crucial to draw a distinction between a true threat and mere hyperbole. The Supreme Court has subsequently reaffirmed that true threats are not speech safeguarded under the Constitution. But the lower courts have split as to how to determine what's a true threat. Some courts have said, as did the Colorado court in this instance, that it's an objective standard. If a reasonable person would feel threatened by the speech, then it's not safeguarded by the First Amendment. On the other hand, some courts have said it's a subjective standard. It has to be proven that the speaker desired to threaten the listener. Billy Ray Counterman lived in Colorado, and he sent a large number of threatening messages to a musician in Colorado. Ultimately, the musician filed a complaint, and Counterman was prosecuted, and the jury was instructed that so long as they could find that the person receiving the messages reasonably felt threatened, that's enough for conviction. That's consistent with the First Amendment. Counterman was convicted and sentenced to 4.5 years in prison. Counterman says to the Supreme Court, it was never my intent or desire to threaten, and without such subjective intent, the speech can't be punished. Colleges, universities prohibit speech that's true threats. This case will be important in deciding, well, what is a true threat? How is that to be determined? Third set of cases that I want to talk about for college universities are ones that involve affirmative action. On Monday, October 31st, the Supreme Court heard oral arguments in two cases, Students for Fair Admission versus University of North Carolina and Students for Admission versus Harvard College. And they involve whether college universities can continue to engage in affirmative action. In 1978, in Regents University of California versus Bakke, in 2003, in Grutter versus Bollinger, and most recently in 2016, in Fisher versus University of Texas, Austin, the Supreme Court said that colleges and universities have a compelling interest in a diverse student body, that college universities may use race as one factor among many in admissions decisions to benefit minorities to enhance diversity. But the issue now before the Supreme Court is whether to overrule those earlier decisions. Why are there two cases about this before the Supreme Court? The Constitution including the 14th Amendment and its guarantee of equal protection, applies only to the government. Hence, Students for Fair Admission versus University of North Carolina involves whether or not public institutions can engage in affirmative action. Private entities don't have to comply with the Constitution, but Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act says that recipients of federal funds cannot discriminate on the basis of race. The Supreme Court has said that the standard under Title VI is the same as under the Constitution. Hence, the suit Students for Admission versus Harvard College is based on Title VI. The oral arguments lasted 5.5 hours on Monday, October 31st. I don't think there's anyone who listened to them who has doubt that the Supreme Court is likely to overrule Bakke and Grutter and Fisher. Mentioned that the last case about this in the Supreme Court was in 2016. It was a 4-3 decision. Why only 7 justices? That was the year Justice Scalia died and Justice Kagan was disqualified because she'd been involved in the case as Solicitor General of the United States. Justice Kennedy wrote for the court, joined by Justices Ginsburg, Breyer, and Sotomayor. Justice Alito wrote a vehement dissent, joined by Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Thomas. All 3 dissenters remain on the court. They've been joined by 3 more conservative justices, Justices Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett. So it looks likely that there are 6 votes to bring about an end to affirmative action. I think there'll be important immediate consequences in college universities throughout the country. Some states already had eliminated affirmative action. California did in 1996 in Prop 209, and there was an immediate devastating effect on diversity in California. But California schools in Michigan and Washington State, where there are similar initiatives, have found ways to achieve diversity. And these schools now must be a model for the rest of the country and how to achieve diversity without affirmative action. Finally, in discussing cases that relate to college universities, I want to talk about 2 that were argued at the end of February: Biden versus Nebraska and Department of Education versus Brown. President Trump, early in the pandemic, issued an executive order that put a pause on the need for students to have to repay certain student loans. President Biden continued that, and then for some student loans, he made it permanent. It involves a good deal of individuals. It involves loans up to about $20,000 of repayment, and the overall cost to the federal government is about $400 billion. The president claims the authority to do this under a federal statute called the HEROES Act, and it gives the president the authority to, quote, waive or modify student loan obligations. President Biden is saying his program is waiving student loan obligations, and this fits within the statute. From the oral argument, I think it's going to be hard to find a majority to affirm what President Biden has done. Several of the justices, especially Chief Justice Roberts, focused on something new in the law called the Major Questions Doctrine. The Major Questions Doctrine is a principle the Supreme Court has articulated and applied only relatively recently. It says that when there's a major question of economic or political significance, a federal agency, the president, can act only with clear direction from Congress. The Supreme Court hasn't done much to tell us how to determine what's a major question. The Supreme Court hasn't done much to tell us what's sufficient congressional direction to meet the Major Questions Doctrine. But at the oral argument, Chief Justice Roberts said, for the president to excuse $400 billion of loans obligation is a major question, and there wasn't sufficient congressional direction. Of course, the Biden administration says the statute is clear. The president can waive student loan obligations, and that is congressional direction. This is a case that's going to affect so many people in the country, but also be one that speaks more generally to the scope of presidential power. So, Michelle, that's my quick summary of the cases that I think are most important for colleges and universities. I want to now take the opportunity to introduce the moderator for the next panel, Valerie Strauss, who'll be the moderator of the panel on academic freedom. I've known Valerie for a very long time and admired her greatly. She's been a reporter for the Washington Post for 30 years, focusing on education. She looks both at local and national education. For more than a decade, she's authored the Answer Sheet blog, which chronicles the most vital issues with regard to the world of education. So it's a great pleasure to turn it over to Valerie Strauss.
Thank you, Erwin. It was so nice to listen to you and to hear you. I learned a lot, as I always do when I hear you. And I want to thank Michelle for inviting me to participate. I've been listening, and I've learned a great deal already. The issues that we're all talking about, I see in reporting coverage and for education. And I have to say, after more than 30 years of covering education at the Washington Post, I think that issues of free speech, the issues of academic freedom, the issues that are confronting our political democracy have never been more acute. And so that's why I think that this conversation is really important. Let me start off with introducing our wonderful panel. Two of them are center fellows you saw in the video. Anna Khalid, associate professor in the Department of History at Carleton College, where she specializes in South Asian history. She's a founding member of the Academic Freedom Alliance and hosts a podcast called Banished, which explores threats to free expression in higher education and beyond. Another center fellow is Jeff Snyder, an associate professor in the Department of Educational Studies, also at Carleton College, where his research and teaching focus on educational policy and school reform movements. His work explores questions about race, national identity, and the purpose of public education in a diverse and democratic society. We also have Lynn Gangone, President and Chief Executive Officer of the American Association of Colleges for Teacher Education, and Monroe Gordon, Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs at the University of California at Los Angeles, where he has held several roles since he began his work at UCLA in 2006 as the Chief Administrative and Financial Officer. Let's start off with Anna and Jeff, who will give us a brief overview of academic freedom and tell us a little bit about the work they are doing in this space at the center. Anna and Jeff?
Thank you so much, Valerie. Thank you for the kind introduction. So just wanted to start briefly by rehearsing a few of the key distinctions between free speech and academic freedom to frame the discussion to follow. So I'm sure, as all of you know, right, free speech in the United States is protected by the First Amendment, and public colleges and universities are bound by the First Amendment, but private ones are not. Now, in contrast, academic freedom is a guild right, not a constitutional right. So membership has its privileges, as the old American Express slogan went, and the privileges of academic freedom are primarily reserved for faculty members. So as the American Association of University Professors spelled out, there are three core components to academic freedom. It protects the freedom of inquiry and research, the freedom of teaching, and the freedom of extramural utterance, which is a fancy jargony way of saying, that's what profs speech when they are speaking as individual citizens rather than in their capacities as professors. So the central rationale for academic freedom has always been that open inquiry facilitates the discovery of truth or knowledge, and that the production and dissemination of knowledge is beneficial to individuals and society. The AAUP put it this way: the common good depends upon the free search for truth and its free exposition. Now, for over a century, the AAUP has placed faculty governance at the heart of academic freedom, asserting that professors hold the primary responsibility for educational matters ranging from the curriculum to hiring and promotion. Professors should be able to carry out this work free of political interference. And in 1915, the AAUP quite presciently pointed out that political interference could take three primary forms. The first was the vested interest of trustees. The second was the political considerations of legislators in the case of public institutions. And the third was the unconsidered impulses of popular feeling. So just note for a moment that all three of these factors are converging in attacks against academic freedom in Florida and elsewhere. And just to underscore one of the essential differences between free speech and academic freedom, you think about free speech as the right to express one's ideas, however true or false they may be. But with respect to academic freedom in teaching and research, facts, accuracy, evidence all matter. With academic freedom comes academic responsibility in the form of professional competence. So if I stand out in the public square with a sign that says the world is flat, nobody's going to arrest me, protected by the First Amendment. If I'm a geology professor and I go into Geology 101 with that same sign and spend the term endorsing the flat Earth thesis, that's not protected by academic freedom. That's a kind of educational malpractice because it violates the norms and standards of the discipline. So just to sum up here, so academic freedom is not a license to teach whatever material suits your fancy, not a license to treat students disrespectfully. If a professor's speech inside a classroom serves no legitimate educational purpose, then it's not protected by academic freedom. Amna, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks, Valerie, for that very kind introduction. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So we're charged with talking about academic freedom and its relevance for democracy. And a vibrant civil society and a knowledge sector that is free of political interference, which trains students in independent analysis and critical thinking, are vital ingredients for a healthy democracy. For democracy to thrive, we need the freedom to freely pursue ideas wherever they may lead, teach without the fear of political pressure, and be able to contribute to public discourse. Now, these are all aspects of academic freedom, as Jeff just outlined. In the absence of this freedom, the flow of information in society is likely to be controlled, leaders can't be held accountable, and active civic discourse becomes impossible when the citizenry is uninformed and lacks the ability to think critically. Now, threats to academic freedom are coming fast and furious from all sides of the political spectrum right now. But arguably the most potent ones are coming from state legislatures. Jeff and I spend a lot of time critiquing threats from inside the academy, but today we're really going to focus our comments on what's happening in Florida, because that is what we're researching as part of our work for the UC Free Speech Center. Following higher ed news coming out of Florida is like drinking from a fire hose. It's ground zero for Ron DeSantis's fight against so-called woke indoctrination. And there's been a whole host of legislation in Florida, from House Bill 233, which allows students to record their professors' lectures without their permission. And those lectures can then be used for disciplinary or legal actions, to HB 7, more popularly known as the Stop Woke Act. There are many more in between, and I won't, I assume everyone is aware of those, but happy to discuss later. And then, of course, there are other things going on, like the takeover of New College. It's a small liberal arts college in Sarasota, Florida, and it's known as a liberal bastion in the state. DeSantis recently installed 6 new conservative trustees, including the infamous Christopher Rufo, and the president was fired promptly thereafter. His latest salvo, DeSantis's latest salvo, is House Bill 999, which frankly should be called House Bill 666, given how evil it is. It's an all-out assault on the core components of academic freedom, faculty expertise, faculty autonomy, and faculty governance. If passed, this bill would defund any programs or campus activities that espouse DEI or critical race theory rhetoric. It would ban statements for hiring, diversity statements for hiring and promotion. And in terms of teaching, HB 999 would effectively ban coursework pertaining to identity politics, which is never defined, critical race theory, which also not defined, DEI, and gender studies. Given how little many administrators know about these fields, any course pertaining to race, racism, sex, and sexuality and even social inequality could be deemed as falling afoul of the proposed regulations. In terms of faculty autonomy and governance, HB 999 strips faculty of both of these things. Boards of trustees are responsible for hiring full-time faculty according to the bill, and the president and the board are not required to consult the faculty for recommendations in terms of hiring and promotion. The bill also authorizes university boards to initiate post-tenure reviews at any time for cause. So academic freedom is effectively meaningless if faculty are cut out from the hiring process. Presidents and trustees simply do not have the requisite expertise to make judgment calls about the needs and requirements of academic departments and programs. And it's worth stating here that this is most definitively an attack on faculty expertise. As part of our research, we talked to a lot of people in Florida, faculty in Florida, and it was really kind of chilling to find out that the president of the United Faculty of Florida, we spoke to him and he talked about he's had dozens and dozens of faculty come to him and tell him quietly that they don't feel comfortable teaching certain topics, mostly related to race and gender, and that many of them are actually dropping full syllabi. In fact, there was a profile of Jonathan Cox in Politico and Atlantic, which you may have read, about how he's just stopped teaching. He's an assistant professor in Florida, and he stopped teaching race-related courses in the sociology department. And in the fall last year, I think the sociology department he's in offered 39 courses, and not one of them dealt with issues of race. So we spoke to Ellen Schrecker, who's Professor Emerita at Yeshiva University, and she's written the book on McCarthyism in the universities. And we asked her to comment on what's happening in Florida. And she said, without hesitation, that today is by far worse. According to her, even though prior attempts to ban particular speakers and organizations from campus, notably communist or socialist individuals or organizations, have taken place, the attempt to prohibit the expression of particular ideas is unique to our current moment. When ideas are banned, it's not just academic freedom that's on the line. The basic integrity of public higher education is at risk. Attempts to undermine the expertise of professors by interfering in curricula and cutting them out of hiring and promotion decisions discredits them in the eyes of the general public. Consequently, they can no longer contribute meaningfully to civic discourse. The fear of punishment breeds a culture of censoriousness. Not only will this limit our ability as a society to hold authorities accountable, it will result in future generations lacking the intellectual nous to engage meaningfully in civic discourse. This kind of fear is what paves the way for the rise of illiberalism and authoritarian rule. At this moment, these attacks on academic freedom threaten the very health of our democracy. Back to you.
Thank you, Amna. That was a great description of what's going on in Florida, which actually has impact far beyond the state. A lot of Republican-led legislatures and governors are finding ways to follow DeSantis, and we have reported, and many others have reported on teachers who are petrified and have pulled, not just in Florida, but have pulled lessons on race and gender and all kinds of issues that they're scared of. One of the things DeSantis did was enable parents to sue teachers. So he's gone really far. And I'd like to turn to Lynn Gangone, who's right in the thick of this and trying to train our nation's teachers. Please tell us what you're facing.
So I have some remarks to set the stage, Valerie. Thank you. And thank you to the Center for the invitation. So essential to our liberal democracy, education is the key to sustaining this country. I open my remarks today by sharing with you the words of Derek W. Black, author of Schoolhouse Burning, Public Education and the Assault on American Democracy. The right to an adequate and equal education, making education the state's absolute and foremost duty, requiring states to exert the necessary effort, financial and otherwise, to provide quality education access, placing education above normal politics, and expecting courts to serve as a check are in the service of something larger, the original idea that education is the foundation of our constitutional democracy. Education is the means by which citizens preserve their other rights. It gives citizens the tools they need to hold their political leaders accountable. It allows children from all stations of life a fair shot at the American dream. Education, when provided for all, embodies the idea that America is a land of opportunity where individuals can become self-made and set their own destiny. Democracy simply does not work well without educated citizens. So the association that I represent, AACTE, was founded in 1948. And back in 1948, we identified 7 principles. And the one that I want to share with you today is one that I think summarizes our work most clearly. And that's the following: to represent the education of teachers before all segments of the public as a professional enterprise carrying special responsibilities for the development of competent citizens. So I would translate that in a following way, that educators are our nation's first responders for democracy. So as Valerie pointed out, AACTE represents higher education institutions, specifically our colleges of education and programs of teacher education, as we together prepare the nation's educators. So we span both higher education and K-12 education. So we're colleges preparing educators to serve in our K-12 public schools. So we're the bridge between them both. And as you've heard today, the rash of laws, policies, and executive orders aimed at undermining those who teach in public K-12 and public higher education, we just simply cannot continue to separate the two from one another. And part of the reason I was asked to be on this panel was to express the following. We in higher education, and I am one of us, right? We have a strong tendency to ignore the public K-12 sector, as though we are not all educators. And so we do this siloing to our detriment, while academic freedom, as Jeff pointed out, is not a part of K-12 educators' privilege. We must look at what first started in the K-12 public education segment with all of these laws and policies, and what's happening now in public higher education, and see them together as part of the same assault, as Derek Black indicated. So how one teaches, who teaches, and what they teach are central concepts to academic freedom. The laws, policies, and executive orders censoring educators in public K-12 and public higher education are aimed, in my opinion, at dismantling public education writ large and compromising our first responders for democracy, who are our educators. So last year, AACTE released a report called The State of Education Censorship in Institutions of Higher Education and Implications for the Field. And that report was authored by Dr. Ashley L. White from the University of Wisconsin in Madison. So Ashley identified 4 themes across states, which I think are important to our conversation today. The first is scapegoating, which inaccurately defines and vilifies important concepts and pedagogy as divisive. The second, the use of broad language as a chilling effect. So divisive concepts, is a rhetorical association to diversity, which, as Ashley said, criminalizes students, faculty, and other educational stakeholders who identify as part of these communities that seem to be targets of this legislation, as well as those who are allies and proponents of diversity of thought in schools. Then the third, and I think we saw this very clearly when we looked back at what had happened in Wisconsin several years ago, there's an implication for public sectors and their employees. Prohibiting divisive concepts in public schools, public higher education institutions, and state agencies affords states greater leverage in monitoring and penalizing institutions, agencies, and their employees. And then fourth, there's the threat of withholding funding. So states have a willingness now to withhold funding from institutions, and it's setting a precedent that others may use to enforce state-sanctioned curricular, what, again, Dr. White calls violence against students and faculty in public higher education. So Ashley goes on to talk about the ways in which this manifests itself in teacher education. And you can imagine that given what we've talked about in terms of the impact in higher education, there are a great deal of similarities. In our educational preparation programs, how do we prepare individuals to go into classrooms where what they teach and how they teach may be suspect? How do we think about academic freedom for teacher educators? How do we think about diversifying the teaching workforce, which is something that we know we all need? And so just to bring this piece to a close, I want to go back to Derek W. Black. And one of the things he says is that 200 years ago, our founding fathers gave us two gifts. The first was democracy, what they called at the time a republican form of government, and the second was public education. And these gifts are inextricably entwined. So my message today is that we are all together the first responders of our democracy, and let us not bifurcate our work and understand that we are all responsible for protecting all of public education, whether it's K-12 or higher education.
Thank you. Before we move on to Monroe, I have a quick question for you, Lynn. The teaching profession, the K-12 is facing a historic crisis.
Yes.
More and more teachers are leaving, fewer want to join. Most Americans for the first time don't want their kids to be one. And so I'm wondering if you have any sense of how much this role of professionalism, of autonomy in a classroom is playing into the shortages, the teacher shortages, and the concern about the pipeline.
Yeah, that's a great question, Valerie. You know, unlike what faculty in higher education have in terms of the opportunity to teach and to impart knowledge, you know, teaching as a profession has been highly regulated for a very, very long time. You know, if you talk to teachers who've been in the field for 30 years or more, what they'll say is continually over the years, we've moved from allowing teachers that freedom to teach to saying, you must teach in this way, or you must teach to the test, et cetera, et cetera. So it's already a pretty constricted environment where teachers feel a lack of agency. In fact, many teachers will say that lack of agency in the classroom actually is equal to the lack of pay. You know, so there's a way in which who we are and how we're brought into the profession and what we want to do is conscribed. So now you take another set of perspectives that turn into legislation and policies that say to the teacher, okay, not only do you have to follow all of these regulations, but now who you are, what you talk about, and how you talk about it is suspect. So, you know, the question then becomes, if we're experiencing a crisis in teaching, which we are, I mean, the amount of individuals who have been interested in teaching as a profession has diminished greatly over the past several years. We have people who think that anyone can teach. It's really a profession. And then we have now restrictions on sexual orientation, gender identity, race, etc. There is not a lot of incentive to become a teacher. And so to me, this latest rash of policies that we're now starting to see at the federal level, I mean, there have been bills introduced now at the federal level through the House of Representatives, do nothing more than discourage any of us who come into the field with difference to say, why would I want to be there?
Sure, thank you. Monroe, you come at this from a different perspective, which I think will be refreshing. Normally, we talk about academic freedom, we talk about the teachers, we talk about the professors. You have a different look on it, about how it impacts other groups on the campus. I hope you can talk about that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I mean, first, I do want to thank you for the invitation, and then also just being a part of this esteemed panel. Really appreciate everyone for the comments. I think I come at this probably less at getting at what both Anna and Jeff were saying, and maybe it's a tag on to what Lynn was saying to some extent, right? And I would like to talk about the siloing in nature as Lynn was going into. Lynn was talking about it from teachers in higher education, but even in a higher education context and perspective, right? I think we oftentimes are very siloed or can be very siloed, and I think that works across purposes for what we're trying to achieve, and particularly as we talk about freedom of speech and academic freedom. Just for everyone's understanding, as I'm the Vice Chancellor of Student Affairs, oftentimes the individuals who set up, work with students, ensure that events are actually proceeding as they should proceed, are practitioners, right? And what I'm going to call educators. So I'm actually changing the name even amongst our staff here at Student Affairs at UCLA, because I think at the end of the day, we're all educators. We all fit somewhere in the spectrum of trying to provide for the overall educational development of our students. And as educators, I think we have to ask ourselves the question of how we're protecting everyone in that spectrum. And, you know, I firmly believe in and agree with the tenets of academic freedom as Jeff has laid out. You know, one of the questions, though, you know, as we think about the ways in which we go about protecting those that are considered faculty, how are we also protecting the ability for those to speak who are other educators on the campus and are further in that within that spectrum of ensuring that we have multiple perspectives coming to campus, being able to provide opportunities for speech on the campus. And so it can be, as you can imagine, very precarious for a lot of these individuals. And, you know, I guess the point of it is that, you know, as our practitioners and educators who are not faculty or who are not considered to be faculty, oftentimes feel pretty ignored and left out and vulnerable. And I think that works at the cross purpose of what we're trying to achieve in the whole construct of free speech, of allowing for as many perspectives to ultimately come to campus. The last thing I would say on this is I think you know, from a university perspective, I'm also an administrator at a university, right? And we want to make sure, and part of our principles and values is to ensure that we are not regulating speech based on content in any way, shape, or form, but we're allowing all speech to come to campus. Having said that, institutions do have voices, and institutions do speak out, particularly when there's something that occurs that works in contravention of our principles and our values. Now, the institution, though, is made up of people. And so as we think about, you know, the individuals who are faculty and their ability to speak out, I think we also have to recognize that there are educators who are not faculty who need to be able to speak at certain times. And, you know, currently the way in which we operate oftentimes doesn't allow for those educators to be able to speak.
Thank you. We have some good questions. And Monroe, I'd like you to start off with answering the first one, which is something that we had thought about discussing anyway. And so this question phrases it very well. Do you think that the general public understands what we mean by academic freedom? If they do not, should we care? And if we should care, have we already lost the battle to get the public to understand what is at stake? When we talk about echo chambers, it is sometimes viewed as the ultimate echo chamber and struggles translating our efforts in making it matter. So do people understand academic freedom? If they don't, is that the fault of the people, the academics who depend on it? And why should anybody outside a university care?
Yeah, I'll start with this. I mean, I know that the question didn't ask this, but I don't think people understand free speech, right? So if we go back a little bit, I would say that, you know, free speech can be very, very complicated, and I don't think people understand that. And so I think if you're not unable to understand free speech, if you don't understand it, then it's hard to then understand other concepts such as academic freedom. But so my answer is no, I don't think that there is a widespread understanding of it. At the same time, you know, the other part of the question is why should we care? And I think we should care, right? At least for myself, I work at a university. And so we're all about knowledge. We're all about making sure that we're providing an educational basis for not just for the students who are here, not just for the faculty and staff, but really for the community and in great respect for the world. So I do think that we should definitely care. Now, this is where I think we can be a little more creative, right? Clearly, there are other ways for us to be able to get this message out. And so, you know, part of what I would say is, you know, how are we being as inclusive as possible in our efforts to try to educate the broader populace about what these concepts actually mean? And, you know, I know that for many of us who sort of work in the field and who do this every day, sometimes there becomes a bit of a frustration because we feel like we're sort of screaming into the wind at times. But I also think that that provides an opportunity for us to potentially think differently and maybe invite other stakeholders in to ask them about the ways in which we can get this message out more broadly.
Anybody else? Jeff, you want to shot?
Yeah, I'd love to add on to what Monroe was spelling out. I do think that academics, all of us involved in academia at any level, need to do a better job communicating these values, from the virtues of free speech to that of academic freedom. To the broader public, I think that you can ask some basic questions that would reveal the importance, the centrality of academic freedom to the public good. Do you care about clean air? Do you care about potable water? Do you care about climate change? Do you care about racial justice? These issues that are so vital are controversial, and faculty need to be insulated in order to do that research. There are plenty of people who don't want us to be doing research about climate change, right? There are plenty of people who aren't particularly interested in the history of redlining in the United States if we're talking about racial segregation, racial justice. So I think these elements that are essential to the public good, you need to have a kind of firewall and insulation from political pressures from industry and corporations, in order to pursue research on touchy questions that are nonetheless vital.
Hey, Valerie, can I just interject
Sure, go
for a
ahead.
minute? You know, I'm just looking through the chat, and I'm seeing individuals asking questions sort of on what to do. And, you know, one of the projects that I'm actually very impressed with is a project at the University of Wisconsin-Madison called the Discussion Project. And I would encourage anyone who is looking at, how do I manage these conversations, right? Because, you know, Jeff, part of what you're talking about is what they would consider perhaps closed questions or open questions, right? And so there are certain questions that are closed that we could feel a level of confidence about in terms of discussing, but there are open questions, and climate is a good example of one of those open questions. So part of what the Discussion Project does is it works with higher education faculty and K-12 teachers, and actually creates a capacity for faculty and teachers to understand and appreciate how to create those dialogues that need to exist inside of a classroom. Because I'm also reading some ways in which, you know, how are we protecting this group, or how are we protecting that group? And candidly, in my opinion, it's not about protecting. I mean, Jeff and Amna, you wrote a great article in the Chronicle of Higher Ed. And at the end of it, you said, you know, you quoted Hannah Gray, who said, our goal, you know, education isn't to make people comfortable. It's to create the capacity for individuals to think. And so, you know, we really have to consider, how do we create classroom environments that really do allow for that exchange of views. You know, and interestingly, I think it was yesterday, a study came out that looked at what's happening with controversial conversations on campus and faculty. And what the study found, and I can get you the citation, is that students are more afraid of saying what they think than necessarily feeling as though their faculty are trying to sway them one way or the other. And, you know, as a practitioner, I just always want to present, like, there are these theoretical, you know, does everyone know what academic freedom is? Maybe they do, maybe they don't. But what we all know is that our country needs to be in engaged and constructive dialogue across various opinions. And so how do we do that?
So Lynn, can I just come in here, Valerie, for something?
Sure.
So I think what you're saying is spot on. And actually, I think one of the problems is what we've seen recently is that the stakeholders on campus have a very poor understanding of both academic freedom and freedom of speech. You can look at how administrators have responded in the case of Hamlin or McAllister, University of Florida, when they wouldn't let them testify. You can look at how Stanford Law School students recently shut down the judge who was trying to speak. And I think we do a really poor job on our campuses to tell students and other stakeholders what academic freedom means and what freedom of expression is. So perhaps the best way, I mean, the population at large definitely needs to know why this is important, but I think we're failing somewhere on our own campuses. And I find I've tried several times to have these kinds of conversations on my own campus and other campuses, and it seems like the space to talk about these things is being very tightly controlled. So whether that's because of the neoliberalization of higher education and the customer is right approach where they don't want to ruffle feathers, or if there are other reasons, I think we're certainly confronting a moment where we see legislators, administrators, students, and even some faculty have very little understanding of what these concepts are.
One of the things that a couple questioners have raised is the issue of essentially whether college campuses have been ideologically captured by the left, by people pushing equity, diversity, inclusion. Clearly, the DeSantis and his crew in Florida believe that, and I just got a flash, by the way, that the new college that you spoke about, Amna, just fired its diversity director, which is no surprise. But can we speak to that? Have they been captured by left wing? Is there room for conservative thinking on college campuses? And how does that play into the idea of academic freedom? Anybody want to tackle that?
I'm happy to take that on.
Good.
I think elite institutions for sure are captured by a particular kind of dogma. And I wouldn't call it diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'd call it DEI Inc., as Jeff and I have done in pieces that we've written, because it's not really about these values. It's about a very doctrinaire approach to what they think these values, or how they think these values should be pursued. And I actually think most of them are pretty flawed. So in that way, it's become, again, it's one of these industries that has encroached on campus. And I feel elite institutions are captured by it. Having said that, I'm not sure if all institutions are. I don't know what community colleges are like. I think less elite institutions are not partaking in this. And one of the reasons that I think that even elite institutions have become sites of capture for such dogma is precisely because people on the left have not critiqued it. That's when it becomes something for the right to then take and run with. So it's part of lack of self-critique, which has led to these institutions, the elite ones I'm talking about, becoming echo chambers, and also now that have contributed, they're not responsible entirely, but they've certainly contributed to how the right is weaponizing this.
You know, and if I can just interject, I mean, thank you, Amna, for that. And of course, that was one of the pieces I read that you and Jeff had authored. When an individual goes into teaching, part of what they're looking at is being able to actually interface with all of their students, believe it or not, right? And what we know about the demography of today's student in the public school systems is that they are racially and ethnically diverse. They are linguistically diverse. They are diverse in terms of ability. There are disabled students, both with learning disabilities and physical disabilities. They are, you know, male, female, cisgender, transgender, you know, so you've got a teacher who genuinely wants to be in that classroom with those students. And I think that gets lost. The other thing that I think gets lost and has been captured is that somehow parents and families are not engaged, and that we don't pay attention to the communities from which our students come. And when you look at the work in community colleges, when you look at the work of the regional comprehensive institutions around the country, when you look at all of that recruitment work that we do with students and families, I mean, there's a misnomer, right, that is being portrayed in a particular way, and we're not going in and throughout the different sectors and levels of education in this country to create, you know, and I hate that it's a counter argument, because teachers have always engaged in families. And now there's this notion that families are being left to the wayside and teachers are indoctrinating students with a particular viewpoint, when all they're really trying to do is understand all the students in their classroom.
If I could briefly add on to Lynn's point, I mean, I bet the mortgage, I bet the house and the family farm and everything else that the overwhelming majority of educators from K to 12 and on to college are not indoctrinating their students. So I think we need to distinguish between the political values that educators hold as private citizens, as individuals, and then the ways in which they teach their material in class. right? And I can certainly speak to the level of higher education in the social sciences and humanities. A lot of my colleagues are liberal. That's a fact that liberals, there are far more liberals in college campuses than conservatives. But when it comes to, let's say, teaching history, I think the public may perceive that as I'm going to come up and give you certain opinions or kind of narratives, and I will want you to accept them as my student, right? But the idea is, no, history is about evidence and texts and arguments, right? So there are these parameters that we operate for our disciplines that encourage critical thinking and that require rigor and sophistication. So I just think this idea that profs and teachers, librarians are quote unquote indoctrinating kids is just so far-fetched and profoundly misguided.
Absolutely. I think not for the purposes of the few minutes we have left, but I think that this whole conversation also needs to be placed within the whole context of assaults on public institutions in general. A lot of this is being led by people who want to kill public education. It's led by people who as Jeff and others have mentioned, it's a war on expertise. So you have governors now who've decided public health officials can't tell the public what to do during the next pandemic. They don't have the right anymore. They can't tell school districts what to do in terms of public health. So we're seeing this is all in that context. But I have a quick question for Jeff and Amna that a reporter at the Chronicle of Higher Ed would like to have answered. So I like to help the working press. But real quick, how likely do the panelists think anti-DEI and anti-tenure bills to pass and go into effect both in Florida and elsewhere? Anyone?
I think they are likely, unfortunately, to go into effect in places like Florida and Texas and elsewhere. And I just want to draw a quick distinction. I think we have to distinguish between good faith critiques of DEI, especially the DEI industry, and what are clearly right-wing attempts to use this phrase in the same way that critical race theory has been mobilized as a cudgel, as a form of whipping up kind of hatred and animosity, especially towards people of marginalized identities.
I'll come in and say I too am worried. I think these things are going to go ahead. And what worries me is that, there's one thing that we call DEI Inc., but then like in places like the University of Florida, DEI encompasses a lot more than just these ideas that are dogma. It's what comes under the DEI framework is also like first-gen students,
Yes.
students who, and this is very troubling to think if those initiatives, because they're all couched under that umbrella. So I have a critique of DEI Inc., but I would like to see first-gen students on college campuses, and I'd like to see them supported. And it's very distressing to think what the implications could be. So I think this is very real, and I think it could happen, and it will happen. I'm heartened by the likes of Judge Walker, who have issued an injunction against the Stop Woke Act. And I think the courts can play a very important role over here. But part of the problem is this is a time game as well. Even if courts say no, in between it's about getting the nomination and riling popular opinion.
Okay, we have a hard stop in 3 minutes. So I'd like whoever wants to make a final comment to have the time to do it. One of the things we didn't get to, which I think is really important in this academic freedom discussion, is tenure, what's happening to it, what it means, and why. So if anybody wants to throw that in there, 45 seconds everybody has to make a comment, you can do that. But does anybody have something that they want to tell the audience about anything, what they could do, what they can't do? I'm going to stop talking now. Who wants to go?
I'll just go really quickly, and I want to harken back to what Lynn said earlier, which is, I think it's very easy to draw some quick conclusions about, whether this or that is sort of taking over higher education. Where we really have opportunities here, and where I think there's been a bit of a failure in the last few decades in particular, are teaching individuals and providing them skill sets to dialogue across difference. Keeping people sitting down at the table to be able to engage with one another and to be able to engage in critical thought about things that they may not otherwise agree with, is a real opportunity for us. And so as I leave this conversation, that's one of the things I would put my great focus on.
Thank you. Anybody else have any final words? Then we will leave it at that. Thank you all so much. I learned so much from you. I could sit in here and talk with you about this very subject for the rest of the afternoon, but we can't. So thank you, Michelle.
No, thank you, Valerie and Jeff and Monroe and Lynn and Amna. We could spend 2 days talking about this, and I know that I'm eager to read and learn from Amna and Jeff and their research, and to continue to work with Monroe and Lynn as we move forward. And Valerie, thank you so much. And this is going to be a great setup for what's going to be our next discussion, which is about why dialogue is important to democracy and some of the ways to dialogue. But before we turn to that, I want to introduce you to Melanie Zement, who is the Center's new program associate. She's a graduate of the University of California at Santa Barbara. She's a journalist, earning her Bachelor of Arts degrees in communication and English. She was the opinion editor and later the managing editor of the Daily Nexus, the student newspaper. And she's going to tell us a little bit about the UC Voice opportunity.
Hello, and thank you, Michelle, for the introduction. I am incredibly excited to have become part of the Center team, and as a former Voice recipient myself, it is a pleasure to speak with you today about the Center's Voice Initiative. Started in 2020, the Valuing Open and Inclusive Conversation and Engagement Initiative provides up to $5,000 in funding for UC students, staff, and faculty who are interested in conducting research or coordinating programs and activities that further the Center's mission. So far, the Center has awarded voice funds to 64 recipients, including 23 undergraduates, 14 graduates, and 19 administrators, as well as 8 faculty members. Past projects have included the creation of the Davis Journal of Legal Studies, the first undergraduate academic journal at UC Davis, the Civic Engagement Scholars Program, and undergraduate course on civic engagement at UCSB, go Gauchos, and Teaching While Black, a series of workshop events at UCLA. For my voice project back in 2020, I created a project with my friend and fellow opinion editor, Harper Lambert, at the Daily Nexus, UCSB's student-run newspaper, aimed at facilitating dialogue on campus. With the support of the Center community and the resources provided by the Voice Initiative, we were able to grow our What If conversation in the newsroom to a We Did It reality. We produced over 15 episodes that covered issues like COVID testing at UCSB during the height of the pandemic and student food insecurity. So for those of you at a UC whose interest is now piqued, we are now accepting applications for our 2023-2024 class of Voice recipients. If you are interested in learning more, please scan the QR code that you see on your screen now. Now I have the honor of introducing our next session, which is Democracy Demands Dialogue. We first hosted our next speakers, Dr. Tanya Israel and Manu Meal, on an episode of our Speech Matters podcast. Their conversation about how to have conversations was so well received that we knew we had to bring them back to speak today. Dr. Tanya Israel is an Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and a Professor of Counseling Psychology at UC Santa Barbara. And she is also the author of the book, Beyond Your Bubble, How to Connect Across the Political Divide, Skills and Strategies for Conversations That Work. And Manu Meal serves as the CEO of the youth-led 501c3 nonprofit, Bridge USA. Center Executive Director Michelle Deutschman will be rejoining to moderate their discussion, and welcome to you all, and thank you.
Okay, I'm back, and I'm lucky to be joined by Tanya and by Manu. I think our last panel really set it up perfectly, which is that people are really struggling with how to talk to one another, whether it's in the classroom or outside the classroom. And so what I'm hoping the two of you can do is sort of talk about why higher ed presents a unique opportunity to dialogue. And maybe we can start about talking about how do we begin to talk to one another and how do we create an environment on campus that's going to facilitate that. So let's start with those couple questions. You want to kick it off, Tanya?
Sure. Thanks so much, Michelle. I'm delighted to be here and so happy to get to have another conversation with Manu. Um, I have been at UCSB for 23 years now, and I think that higher education is such an ideal place to be able to have dialogue and to promote free speech. We have students entering college eager to learn. They are encountering people from varied backgrounds with a variety of values who they might not have encountered before. And they're being introduced to not only new ideas, but what I think is even more important is ways of thinking about knowledge. And I think that all of that really sets a great stage for having dialogue. I don't know that we are capitalizing on that opportunity, but I think it's a great setup. And I'm going to pass it off to Manu then, because I feel like he's really been doing the work with Bridge USA of taking advantage of that opportunity.
Yeah, thanks, Tanya. And again, it's awesome to be here with you. Michelle, thanks for having me. Thanks for the work that y'all are doing. Y'all can't get rid of us this quickly, so we're back. I think the way that I think about this is that, you know, I lead an organization called Bridge USA, which, as Tanya said, we have college and high school chapters, and we're specifically focused on the students. I actually have a different take, I think, than a lot of the folks in the last panel I know pretty well, in that I actually think that most young people want dialogue. I think most young people want to lead with empathy. They want to listen. They want conversations. But I just don't think that the social permission on campus exists to have those conversations. I actually don't think that the problem that we're trying to solve is as complex as we make it out to be. And here's why. I think that when I think about why higher ed is so important for this, the critical question that we ask at Bridge is not why should we have these conversations, but what happens if we don't? And if we don't have conversations with the next generation, is understanding how to deal with those complex issues, being able to live in a world that is so incredibly diverse, being able to inherit a society where they can exchange ideas, solve problems. What if we don't have that world? Then all of this falls apart. And I think if you can make that case in a really concerted, concise, and effective way, then I think what you have is actually a student population that's really receptive. We just have to build the structures on campus for them to be able to engage.
So if I can, I love hearing that, Manu. Can you talk a little bit more about what you're seeing among students that's making you optimistic? Because I think it's great to be able to share that view that you have with other people.
Yeah, and I have a thought for you as well at the end of this, Tanya. I think on my side, there are two stories that come to mind. The first is the way that we got started. I think many folks in the audience might know this, Michelle, but our story began in 2017 when Milo Yiannopoulos came to UC Berkeley, and I think it kickstarted this entire hoopla. And I was this like teeny freshman then, and I remember the next day we created the space for students to just be able to reflect, and almost we called it talk therapy for campus. It was essentially just a way to decompress in the conversation. We invited the protesters, the students that were protesting, we invited the administrators, and I mean the level and intensity of really constructive disagreement was excellent. And I think that's what I saw in that case. When we were at Arizona State, we talked about immigration. On other campuses, we talked about student homelessness. I mean, again, students are really passionate about how to have these dialogues. Question I've got for you is, as an administrator and as an educator, like, how do you think about supporting students in that journey, and what have you seen in sort of your process?
Oh, well, thanks for sharing a little bit more about how you got started on things. What I see is that students really do want to learn, and they want to engage with the material, and they want to engage with each other. I see that in the classroom. I think we have to sometimes set the right conditions in the classroom for people to feel, you know, for students to feel comfortable to step in with their questions and with their perspectives that might not be fully formed yet, and to help people think about how to ground your argument, how to find the evidence and find the different ways of thinking about things. I also see really that there's so much work being done by the folks on our campus who are in student affairs and housing, because that's really where a lot of the more one-on-one interactions take place, is within these kinds of environments outside the classroom. So I think that there are things that we, what I see as a teacher on campus is, what do we do in the classroom to create those conditions? But what I see from more of an administrative perspective is there's also work that's being done by so many different partners on campus on the academic side and the non-academic side to help people where they're coming into contact with each other. And that's really where we have some opportunity. And we can create that contact in lots of different environments on campus.
One of my questions, and one of the things I hear from a lot of people, is that they really want to do this and role model it, but they don't really know where to start. And so, kind of like putting the key in the ignition. And I know, Tanya, you have some thoughts about ways to conceive of this. And I was hoping that you could share that with folks today.
Absolutely. And I want to hear from Manu also about how you do that in Bridge USA. But the things that I recommend starting with is, first of all, people have to want to do it. If they don't want to do it, then we're not going to get anywhere. And indeed, students and faculty and staff, like everybody on a college campus, may have some interest in doing it, but also we're all subject to having misperceptions of who the other side is, who are those other people who have those different values and perspectives, who we might be talking to. And a lot of those misperceptions are really fomented by the media and by social media. And as a psychologist, I can say also just by our own cognitive biases. So we tend to view people who are, if we're in a political party, we tend to view people in the other political party as being more extreme than they actually are. We see them as being uninformed, irrational, morally bankrupt. Like, we have some views of them that are distorted by our minds and by media and social media. So the first thing we have to do maybe is to get a more accurate perception to correct those distortions. And again, I think in higher education, we really should be thinking about how do we accurately understand the world, including other people. Then you've got to have that curiosity of, okay, maybe I'm not understanding. How do I know more? I want to know more. And here's a person in front of me who could actually help me understand another perspective. And then there are skills that I recommend and that I teach about listening, perspective taking, encouraging elaboration, and how to share our own perspectives effectively. And also, how do we manage emotions when our buttons get pushed?
What about you, Manu? Especially, how do you mobilize Gen Zers to want to engage in this, or to want to engage?
Yeah. What's fascinating is I think about actually how Bridge USA has sort of grown over the past couple of years. So when you and I first met, Michelle, we had about 3 chapters, I think. Then we had 20, then we went to 30. Now we're at 50 college, 20 high school. Last semester, we engaged 3,500 students across all of our campuses. I mean, the demand for this is through the roof. And what Tanya is perfectly set up is actually, I think, 3 assumptions that we make that makes this work seem perceptually challenging, but not actually that difficult. I think starting is actually quite simple. And so the 3 assumptions that I want to break down. One is on the point of media. We actually just recently commissioned a study with an organization called, or we worked with an organization called Starts With Us that commissioned a study that found that over the last 4 months, the media covered extreme figures like Marjorie Taylor Greene 45x compared to anybody that's trying to fix problems. What you're painting and showing the next generation is a country in complete disarray. It's like you're telling everybody to buy a stock and the stock sucks, right? If that's all you've got, if 45x, of course, if that's the only thing we're fed, then what we're going to imagine is not only is free speech or discussion or dialogue impossible, but what's the point? It's all over, right? And so I think the first thing that the challenge, aggressively to Tanya's point, is that the extremes don't actually dominate in terms of numbers. What they've got is a really loud microphone. I don't think we're living through a moment of mass polarization. I think the moment that we're living through is where the loud minorities imposing its closed-mindedness on an exhausted majority. The second assumption I think we've got to tackle is exactly what Tanya said, which is that we overestimate how extreme the other is. There's countless studies that show that when you poll and you ask a really strong liberal person, what do you think of a conservative? Like the first two names that come to mind are Tucker Carlson and Donald Trump, right? When you ask somebody that's a conservative, what do you think of liberals? Like the first two things they think about is like open borders and a bunch of people taking over the country. That's just not true in terms of the numbers. And I think the third thing that we have to see on students and on campus, to Tanya's point, is not only that most students are interested, but again, if we let the loudest voices dominate, and by loud, I don't mean just ideologically extreme. You can have very strong beliefs. We should hold those beliefs. We should have those disagreements. The question is, how are we showing up to have those disagreements? And so when you actually take a look at the students that are showing up to have those disagreements, might be a few, but we've got most kids and they're ready. So it's, what can you do as an administrator to support that? With Bridge, it's what is the grassroots solution? I think that if you combine students, administrators, and faculty, you have a three-levered system. And the secret, again, is that these are all assumptions that we make about why this work is difficult, but it's actually, in reality, not that difficult.
I love that, Manu, the research that you're sharing about what's going on in the media. One of the there's a great organization called More in Common that's doing some of
they're fantastic.
Really crucial research. I know that's really informing us about how we are perceiving versus what reality is. And in their study, The Perception Gap, one of the things that's fascinating is that we think that the news is keeping us informed, but it turns out that the more we watch the news, the more skewed our perceptions are of people on the other side. And so I think it's really important for us to recognize the ways in which we're not understanding who those other people are and what that's doing. Whereas we might not be as ideologically polarized as we think we are, what's happening because of that perception of ideological polarization and those perceptions of other people is what we call affective polarization. And affective polarization is about the feelings we have about those other people, the vitriol that we have about people on the other side. That's actually what I'm most worried about. It's not the ideological polarization. We've had different views in this country since, before the founding of it. And so it's important that we can figure out how to work with those differences and have those differences. But having that hatred toward people on the other side is not actually helping to advance our democracy.
Michelle, could I just underscore something that Tanya said there about affective polarization?
Absolutely.
So I think, and by the way, this just feels like doing a live podcast recording. This is like a throwback to our podcast conversation. So, Tanya, what's really interesting is this throws me back to actually our most recent summit. So every year we hold a summit in a city that's hopefully warm. And the idea is we get all these students from across the country that are advocating and fighting for more dialogue, more engagement on campus, fighting for better disagreement. And I remember, to your point of ideological polarization versus affective polarization, we surveyed our students and we had 28% liberal students, we had 28% conservative students, 44% like independent, politically homeless, for that third category. Those numbers almost sound fake. And so we've released all of our data and how we collected it. And what you find is actually that we had students across the board with very strong ideological differences showing up. But the key sort of uniting factor was all of these students that were showing up, while they were ideologically disparate, they were temperamentally aligned. And I think we have to reshape the debate in our politics and on campuses. This is not a left-right question. This is a question of whether you're open-minded or closed-minded, whether you can deal with complexity and nuance, or if you prefer a simple world, if you believe in black-white binaries, or you believe in diversity and nuance and engagement. And I think that's, to your point, how we fight that affective battle. I don't know, what do you think that resonates with sort of your experience?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I love that. And I love that diversity of people you're bringing together in terms of what their values might be, but that similarity in terms of what is driving them and what is their temperament. A characteristic that is really helpful for these kinds of dialogues is intellectual humility. Intellectual humility is people think, oh, you're going to have to compromise your values if you're going to even listen to somebody who's got a different perspective. But it turns out that you can have strong, even more extreme and deeply held values and still be respectful of and curious about somebody who's got a different perspective, a different point of view. And in fact, I think it's more empowering if we can understand a different perspective. People are sometimes saying like, oh, I simply cannot understand how somebody can think that or vote that way, as if it's a source of pride to not be able to comprehend something. And so I think, wow, if we can actually learn something to understand how other people are getting to where they've gotten to, that will really help us in whatever we're trying to do. If we're trying to convince them or persuade them, or if we're trying to stay connected to somebody who we care about, or if we're just trying to broaden our understanding of how people think or find common ground, for any of those things, we have to be able to understand other people.
I'm gonna take a second to interject, if that's okay, even though I hate to interrupt, but we have a question that I'd like to pose. It's directed to you, Manu, but I also think, Tanya, always interested in your thoughts. Asking about how Bridge USA promotes the value of wide open free speech, even ideas that are hateful or offensive. And I think that's an important question, not just for this conversation, but for so many that we've had today.
Yeah, Tanya, I think that's the central question to all of this. That's, I think, what's animated the free speech debate in this country for 250 years. It's a question that I still don't have the perfect answer to. In fact, we just actually hired new folks from our student network to work full time. And that's the first question that a lot of them ask every time when we're onboarding is, well, how do we navigate on these campuses hate and offense with an environment that is ideologically diverse and intellectually humble? I think about three things on this question. The first is that I think hate is highly subjective. And here's what I mean by that. I remember we held a discussion at Berkeley where we had this LGBTQ activist show up, and they felt like the discussion that we were having offended their identity and humanity. This was when we were freshmen. So like, we don't have it figured out right now. We really didn't have it figured out then. And remember, they got really heated, they got really engaged. And I didn't think that the topic necessarily was actually that hateful. I thought it was a policy question. Next day, that same activist came up to a discussion on immigration. Now, I'm a child of immigrants, and the way that they approached this question was extraordinarily offensive to me and personally hateful. The same person that perceived hate yesterday was throwing hate today. Point is that if we operate on a question of what I perceive to be hateful, then we're going to be playing whack-a-mole with every idea you see. The second thought here is that when we think about our constructive models of disagreement on campuses, these chapters, they're held and led by student moderators that are highly trained by scholarship and folks like you that have produced a lot of trainings and materials on how to have these conversations. I think you can speak a lot to how to navigate that. And the third quick thing is, again, the question of what happens if we don't have those conversations? What happens if we don't? We ask too many times, why is it important? We don't ask the reverse. We live in a country of 330 million people, the most diverse society in the history of humanities, with beliefs and ideas and cultures and experiences. That takes a lot of work. And the only way we navigate that is by creating that culture that favors ideas that win out. But I'd love to hear, how do you engage that question? I'm curious from your perspective, because that's a question I always wrestle with.
Yeah, I feel like you and I are not shockingly in similar places around this, where people say all the time, oh, but those people are so hateful. And it turns out it's another one of our cognitive biases, where we tend to see ourselves as being motivated by benevolence and people who have a different view as being motivated by hatred. And that's, again, there are a lot of ways in which we have flaws in our operating system, as human beings. And it's important first to know about them and then try to correct for them. And one of the best ways, I think, to correct for them is actually hearing how other people are thinking about it. Okay, this is what you believe about immigration, or about, transgender people, or about whatever, the topic is. Like, how did you get there? I think is a question that's helpful to ask people, not what do you believe and how do you justify it? You know, because I think then, you know, people are going with, oh, here's the stand that I have, and I will get deeper into this stand. But if we say, how did you get there? Like how did you form that opinion? We get to hear a little bit more about what has shaped people's views along the way. And sometimes that's experiences that they've had, or values that they've been raised with, or communities that they've come from. And I think we learn so much more about people than if we're asking them to justify their beliefs, which I think gets people even more firmly into them.
I really love that, because it's going back to this idea of the relational aspects between people, right? And I think sometimes we forget about that, and I'm going to really try to use that. I do want to ask one other question. It's something it's been referred to, especially in the academic freedom panel, especially in the classroom, is creating an environment where there is both space for dialogue, but also where we're focusing on facts and data. And how do we join those two things? I think sometimes don't necessarily feel like they go together so easily. And I'm wondering if either of you can share thoughts on that.
Go for it, Tanya.
Okay, so facts and data, obviously very important. That's some of what we are learning to not only use, but generate in higher education. It's also not what changes people's minds. So we all like to think that we will change our minds if we, if the data require that. It's very hard to get people to do that because of confirmation bias, which guides us to pay attention to things that support what we already believe to be true and dismiss or ignore information that contrasts with our existing views. So I think that we need to have facts and data. And ideally, that's going to help us to create good policy. It's going to help to guide research. It's going to help to guide practice. And at the same time, it's not what we should be pulling out to try to get somebody to agree with what we believe or what we believe. It's just not going to be effective in doing that.
Thank you. I can't believe that time. Did you want to add something, Manu? Okay. I can't believe that we're getting close to the end, but I want to make sure I give each of you a chance just to kind of have any final remarks of what you want to share with our attendees today on any of these things, including kind of maybe sort of flagging again why all of this ultimately matters for higher education and democracy, or anything else that you want to share. You want to go ahead, Manu?
Sure. Again, thank you all for putting this on, and thank you everybody for doing the work that you're doing on campuses and wherever you are. And Tanya, again, always awesome to be here and talking to you. I feel like we've become like a regular duo. We got to hit the road. I would say two things. I think one is, if you're interested in either changing culture on campus or creating practices for engagement dialogue, I think the student piece is critical. I think starting a chapter on campus to engage students, or just empowering students to, I think, have the social permission to say this is what they want, is, I think, so powerful, because I think that we're in a norms battle. Again, I think there's a battle of norms. What norms are we pushing on campuses? And norms are flexible. They're not institutions. And I think norms require grassroots mobilization. And if you're interested in thinking about, engaging with Bridge, thinking about the dialogue practices that, Tanya has so excellently perfected over the years, thinking about how we engage, please feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to talk to you and listen and think about how we bring that sort of engagement to your campus. The only other thing I would say is, I think that if we don't get this right, our democracy is in serious trouble. I think this is the cornerstone of our society, of our system. And by this, I mean the higher education system, but more importantly, the next generation. I think that my generation is uniquely positioned to do a lot, but if we don't produce and empower and equip the folks in my generation that are passionate about dialogue, engagement, listening, again, not ideological squishiness, but temperamental moderation, those are different. I think that that's important. If we don't get this right, what we do is we forfeit this super diverse experiment, because ultimately, I think when people think about dialogue, they think about kumbaya circles, but really, when we sit down and engage, when we listen, this notion of free speech, civic engagement, that is the backbone of social change and progress. In fact, I think bridging in today's world is an act of protest, because it is fashionable to decry the end of American call for national divorce, and it is difficult to stand up and say, we're actually going to bring people together and figure this thing out. So I think we just got to push back, and we got to give people the social permission. So yeah, Tanya, you want to close this out?
Oh, yes. Ditto all of that. That's beautiful. And one of the most important things we can probably do to shift those norms is just to communicate our own interest in, curiosity about, openness to hearing other people's views and ideas and experiences. And so each one of us, we can talk about the systems of things, we can talk about the legislation, we can talk about the media, but I always think about what can each one of us do to empower ourselves to create a better democracy, to form stronger relationships with other people. And each one of us has a role in that. And then I also think, some individuals like Manu do incredible things, like then found an organization to bring more people into it. So whatever piece of this, for all of you who are attending today, whatever piece of this you can do, whether it's having just one-on-one conversations with people, or being part of a Bridge USA program, or being part of the the Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement and engaging in the programs, like, do it. We need everyone who has an interest in this to be on board. So thank you all for being here. And it's just been delightful to get to have another conversation with Manu and Michelle.
I want to thank both of you. Clearly, it's very apparent that I am a major part of each of your fan clubs. So thanks for coming back, not just one time, but the second time. And you know what they say, third time's the charm. So who knows what's next? So thank you again. And we are actually coming up on our last panel of the day, which is hard to believe. As I mentioned at the top, Chancellor Gilman isn't able to join us, unfortunately. So we've just used some time to take more of your questions. And we're going to finish on a super high note, which is talking about another First Amendment freedom of the press, in particular, the role of student media. We have a distinguished journalist, Tamara Keith, to moderate today. Tamara is the White House correspondent for National Public Radio, co-host of the NPR Politics podcast. She previously covered Congress and business for NPR, and before that, she worked at member stations KQED, KPCC, and WOSU. She got her start in journalism while in high school as an essayist for NPR's Weekend Edition Sunday, and after completing her undergraduate studies at UC Berkeley, go Bears, became the youngest person to graduate from UC Berkeley's Graduate School of Journalism. That's a double Berkeley degree. She serves on the board of the White House Correspondents Association and is one of the inaugural members of the Center's National Advisory Board, and someone I admire very much. I'm pleased to introduce you to Tamara Keith.
Hi, and I am very pleased to be here with all of you as well, and our most excellent panel, who I'm excited to introduce. We have Somer Ingram Dean, the staff attorney at the Student Press Law Center, Admika Iyer, who is the editor-in-chief of the Daily Nexus at UCSB, and Christopher Ying, the hiring manager and former managing editor of the Daily Cal. And before we get into our conversation, we have a quick poll for everyone here, so let's do that. The question is, how often do or did you read your student newspaper? There are some choices there. Very often, once a week, once a month, infrequently, never, and not applicable. So let's work on getting some results up on the screen. And I think we can all vote. Nope, I can't vote because I'm a panelist, but we'll just wait a moment for the results. And when we have those, then we'll move on to the fun part, which is our conversation. And Admika, I'm sorry I mispronounced your name slightly, but I'm very sorry.
You're totally fine, no worries.
Well, while we wait for poll results, let's just start. And Admika and Christopher, I wanted to ask you, just to get us going in this conversation, can you tell us about a recent story or a recent campus event that you really wrestled with at your student paper that gets at some of the challenges that this discussion is all about?
Sure. I can start if that's okay. So this past quarter, our paper definitely faced a lot of challenges regarding how to report on instances of hate within the student community. The two predominant examples that come to mind are earlier this year, we had a active hate group come into Isla Vista, which is our college town at UCSB, and they disseminated incredibly anti-Semitic flyers throughout the town. And so that was our first challenge, was figuring out, in the context of being a reporter in a community that is facing very visible harm, how do we sensitively and appropriately report on issues of discrimination? And I think that the lessons that we learned through that first instance were how you frame an article really matters. And that starts with the lead and the headline and just how you are approaching that article as a reporter. And so I think one lesson that we learned from that first instance was to not so much dive into the perspective of, here's this incredibly hateful thing that just happened. It's important to highlight that. But it's also important to make sure that your framing involves the community solidarity and the healing efforts and the resistance that these communities show in these instances, right? I think that a trap that journalists fall for many times is, this horrible thing happened. Of course, we want to be entities of accountability and report on these horrible things that are happening within our communities. I think it's important to remember that how we frame and communicate these things that are happening are also as important in that effort of accountability as it is to recognize the things that happened. That same issue came up again when an alt-right activist, Charlie Kirk, who founded TPUSA, was invited by the UCSB chapter of TPUSA to come give a speech on our campus. I think this is a specific instance that many local colleges have recently been getting familiar with, unfortunately. And this posed an interesting situation in understanding how to just report on hate speech. I think our lessons from framing were incredibly important because we were able to, Charlie Kirk is the kind of guy where he feeds off of debate. He feeds off of people engaging with his hate. He is the type of person that wants you to come at him. And so it was also important to us to remember to not engage in that dialogue vitriolically, or to give in to exactly what this person's looking for. So we were able to bring in this concept of framing this from the perspective of community solidarity and resistance. And I think that was incredibly important. I also think what we learned was that we were so invested in making sure that we were appropriately representing what this person was saying and what that means in the context of our time. I do think it's important to hold instances of hate accountable. We should be reporting on them. I think where it gets a little bit dicey is quoting and interviewing, especially with people who are objectively just delivering hate speech. And so that engendered conversations of what is gratuitous and what is important to clarify, right? Like, we can, as journalists, say, this is what this person was espousing without necessarily getting into exactly what that person said and diving into the harmful things they said about marginalized communities. We don't need to highlight that. What we do need to highlight is this happened and here's how people are responding, not engaging with hateful rhetoric. And so, sorry, long answer to a complex question, but I would say that those are two recent events that definitely pose a lot of questions about what it means to report on instances of hate within a community that is experiencing harm first and foremost, and how to mitigate that harm through appropriate coverage, I think was our goal. And I can't say that we're perfect, but I can say that we're learning, and we're going to continue to do better.
Well, I think that is one of the great challenges, right? How to cover something without amplifying, without accidentally amplifying. Christopher, do you have something that comes to mind as a recent instance that the Daily Cal dealt with?
Yeah, there were two that come to mind in particular. The first one is, well, actually, they're very similar to what Mika said earlier.
Maybe there was a speaking tour. Who knows?
Yeah, I mean, we did have Charlie Kirk come to campus recently, but that's not the one that I was thinking of most recently. We also had Matt Walsh come to Berkeley's campus. So it was a very similar situation to when Milo came to campus, and when Ben Shapiro, Ann Coulter, and Charlie came to campus as well. And then the other thing that we had recently, which was very difficult to navigate, was when this conservative news media watchdog called Accuracy in Media, they hired a couple of trucks displaying images of Adolf Hitler saluting with the phrase, all in favor of banning Jews, raise your right hand. And basically what they were arguing is that groups at Berkeley Law, which had passed bylaws to say that they would not want Zionist speakers at their organizations, that was in essence the same thing as anti-Semitism. And so this group, Accuracy Media, was trying to portray these student groups as Hitler, essentially. And they drove these trucks all around campus. There were also trucks displaying the names of those students that belong to those groups all over campus, and basically said, like, you should target these students if you ever see them on campus. So that was very difficult to navigate. I think that the Daily Cal has experienced a lot of, in terms of our reporting, the same issues that Athmika has faced at the Daily Nexus, where it's, how do you report on these issues? How do you acknowledge the harm that was done to these communities? But also at the same time, engaging in the dialogue without amplifying the vitriol, right? Like in the case of the Hitler posters, obviously that is incredibly hateful to be posting something like that, to both the Jewish students that you are purportedly, trying to support, but also to, other students who are now being compared to Hitler, right? It's incredibly difficult to try and navigate that kind of a space. And so, how do we report on this issue without amplifying the vitriol that we've seen on campus? Yeah.
Well, and the provocations are part of the point.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's get our poll results up real quick, and then we will continue the conversation. So it looks like the answer is very often, which is exactly what I would have picked. Not that I remember the late 90s that well, but I think very often was the right answer. So let's continue with the conversation. And Somer, I want to turn to you because you work with student journalists all over the country. So I'm curious, what are the things that you hear about most that are the most vexing for student journalists? And what do you advise about this quandary of sort of navigating provocative speech?
Yeah, so I do work with student journalists all across the country, both at the high school and the college level. And it's really fascinating to see what good and engaging journalism that these young reporters are involved in. So my job at the Student Press Law Center is I help run our free legal hotline. And so we often get questions about how students should go about covering certain things. Are we allowed to write about this? Will we get sued if we write about this? And I'm finding that sort of the longer I'm in this role, the less often I'm able to give a straight, yes, this is legal for you to do sort of answer. It's more about, sure, this is permissive in the law for you to do. it is unlikely you will get sued for this. But sort of taking it to that deeper level of, is this the kind of journalism we want to practice? Is this the kind of what kind of news and information and dialogue do we want to promote in our community? Student journalists are obviously in a very unique position in that the community they are covering, they are, innately a part of. And so I find myself really encouraged by the journalists that do reach out to our hotline. I think that when it comes to things like problematic speech or hate speech, I see student journalists really grappling with this idea of, as Chris and Atmika said, how do we both honestly portray what's going on without sort of elevating these voices that kind of, feed off of that anyway. And so I think what I see a lot of student journalists trying to do is, before they even get to, sort of their coverage of these things, it's really looking at who is in their newsroom, who's making the decisions in their newsrooms, right? Really, diversifying staff and bringing in all those different sorts of lived experiences that will help you in your coverage of an event or whatever it may be that is affecting a certain community. So, sort of starting really at that ground level. I think that I spend a lot of time talking to student journalists about, sort of in a way, sort of rejecting the notion of objectivity and giving equal sides to all or equal attention to all sides of the story, right? I'm a First Amendment lawyer, but I am also a former journalist. And so sort of when I was coming through school, it was all about be objective, no bias. But those sorts of narratives, even if they mean well, often tend to just perpetuate the status quo and those that are in power. And so I talk to student journalists a lot about, when you're covering these sorts of things, right? Just as these student journalists on our panel are saying, they're, finding sort of a nuanced way to communicate what's happened, but without necessarily treating every side as though it is equal or deserves, a place in this dialogue.
Yeah, I'd like to sort of follow on that and talk to Chris and Athmika about how you think about objectivity, or how you how you approach sort of the traditional conventions of journalism at your papers. And do you think that, do you think of yourselves as the campus version of the New York Times or the Washington Post, or do you think that they are like completely out of touch with the reality of the needs of the next generation of journalism?
Chris, is it all right if I start? Or
Go
did
for
you
it.
want to start? Okay, so tough question. I'll start with the
I mean, I don't have an answer, so.
Well, okay. First of all, I will say, I think that I want to underscore my answer by saying my experiences in journalism have been in formats where I didn't necessarily have a lot of mentors or advisors. Just a lot of independent student run work that's kind of bled into my perspectives, but I do think it provides a valuable outside perspective. First of all, I think a reality that we're all kind of now coming to is that objectivity is a little bit BS, because we're human beings, right? Like, you can't expect a human being who has thoughts and perceptions and opinions to engage in a subject matter so thoroughly through interviews and research and to walk out of that space not having an opinion. That, in my opinion, is asking for the impossible. It's just not doable. So I think that objectivity within journalism comes more in the form of avoiding conflicts of interest, more so than, thinking that there is an objective way to report on anything. I think that's a flaw and a misconception that people fall prey to very quickly. And I would say that how we engage, I mean, we call it both sidism, right? Like you reach out to one side, you got to reach out to the other. It's, in my opinion, it's not always applicable, right? Like if we're talking about climate science and we think that we need a climate denier to balance the voices, I'm going to tell you that you're stupid. Please don't give us this disservice. Don't do that. So I do think that like this very traditional approach to, you know, we're taking this thing that's verifiably fact and we're going to say that we're catering to both sidism to seem like we're not biased. Stop. I don't see the reason for it. And to answer the second part of your question, I come back to this idea that whenever we're reporting in student journalism spheres, there's this idea that in order to be the best paper, we have to emulate the practices and the standards of papers like the New York Times and the Washington Post. I think calling them out of touch is a bit generous, actually. I think the reality that we need to face within the journalism industry is one that a lot of industries claimed they were trying to focus on after the death of George Floyd, right? We had a bit of a racial reckoning in this country where we said, you know, we are very in front of us seeing the consequences of white supremacy. And we need to change the way our institutions run because we are propagating these very same principles in our own ways. Journalism is absolutely an institution that is a part of that problem. And I mean, we can continue to do the same thing. We can continue to aspire to the standards that these papers have set and continue to propagate the same issues and commit the same mistakes. I'd like to think we're better than that. I'd like to think that student papers are a space for journalists to rethink what this industry is going to look like, because the truth is the way we currently operate is not okay. And it is imbued with practices that are racist, that are misogynistic, that are xenophobic, right? How many times do we see coverage of crime in low-income communities that's just amplified to portray people as something that they're not? How often do we discuss how, you know, discussions of identity within journalism spaces are so just completely screwed up? And Washington Post and New York Times and all of these other papers, they do the same thing, right? And so, no, I think it's quite generous to call them out of touch. I would call them institutions that propagate the same issues that we as student journalists should be thinking about how to overturn. We should be thinking about how this industry can be remade in favor of not just catering to one demographic or one perspective, but embracing valued perspectives from different sides and not practicing homogeny. That's really the issues I think that we as student journalists need to create the space for. Because, you know, I'm 20 and I've got another year of college left before I'm entering the industry. And I'd like to think that when me and my colleagues come into this space, that we can differentiate between what is the standard and what is right, and we can push for what is right.
Christopher. So, yeah.
Yep. I think I second a lot of what Athmika said. In terms of the Daily Cal's experience with objectivity and reporting, I do think that, you know, I agree with Athmika that it is an impossible ask to ask us to be 100% objective. You know, if there's like a platonic form of objectivity, right? There's no way that we as human reporters can get to that level. And I think that inherently, whenever you conduct an interview, there are going to be biases that come out. And at the end of the day, no offense, we are a student newspaper. We are probably going to be biased towards what most students think on campus, right? There's just no way. Like, and it's like in the case of the accuracy in media trucks that I talked about earlier, there's just no way that the Daily Cal is going to say like, oh yeah, you know, we think that it's a genuine argument that you should be posting Hitler posters around campus. Like, I don't think that that's like a reasonable thing to ask us to say, right? In fact, I can read you a sentence from our coverage from that story. So Accuracy
Please.
Media, abbreviated AIM, claims that this is in defense of Jewish students on campus, many of them, including Zionists, have condemned the trucks in a show of solidarity. So the sentence itself is like, it's objective in the sense that the students have condemned what the trucks have said, but it's also not objective in the sense that we are choosing to cover that perspective and choosing to uplift that particular idea. We have not given the other side as much credit as they would in a platonically objective case, right? But I don't think that we should be aiming for that kind of objectivity. I think that we should always be grounding all of our reporting in facts, right? Absolutely, everything needs to be objective from that standpoint. But when it comes to the voices that we uplift, we inherently choose to do so for particular groups over others. And I think that leads me to the second point of talking about in comparison to the Washington Post or the New York Times. I think that there is this sense among people at the Daily Cal that these are the titans of reporting, right? These are so cool that we want to try and emulate them. But at the same time, when we take a step back and we realize that we're all humans, and even adults can make mistakes. I mean, we rant to each other about all the time about how much we're frustrated with the way that adults have reached out to us and have talked to us about how to report on things. And so it's adults are not, when we as kids, we have this sort of sense that our parents are perfect and the way that they think about things is perfect. There's no way that they make mistakes. And I think there's still a little bit of a sense into that as student reporters. But as we kind of grow into our teenage rebellion years and become grow out of those years and become adults ourselves, we start to realize that everyone makes mistakes. And it's okay to recognize that these papers are sometimes out of touch. For us, one of the things that we're now trying to do at Daily Cal to be more in touch with our community is a platform that I'm pushing forward in my campaign for editor-in-chief, where we're trying to say maybe we should write entire sections of our paper in other languages to make our paper more accessible, and in doing so cover issues that are particularly important to those marginalized groups, try to get more back in touch. Because I think that overall, the Daily Cal is in touch with the student body, considering that it's written and produced by students. But at the same time, a lot of the community members at Berkeley also think that we are a little bit out of touch and that we don't necessarily report on things that are too important to individual members of the community. And so I think that if we try to do that more so towards the marginalized groups and, kind of bypass the objectivity in the sense that we need to ask both sides, but still maintain objectivity in the sense that we need to uplift the truth of what is happening to these communities, I think that that's the direction that the Daily Cal is choosing to go in.
This is kind of a random question, and then I'm going to go to the audience questions, but I'm just going to ask it. And I don't know what the answer will be, but as you seek out diversity in your newsrooms, are you seeking out diversity of viewpoints as well as other measures of diversity? Are you looking for some resident scolds and skeptics to be part of your newsroom?
Athmika, can I take this one first?
Sure, thank you.
Okay.
Absolutely. I think that, something that I find so valuable about just a newsroom is being able to walk in and see my staff of editors and see my writers and everyone who exists in this space and look at our paper to truly understand the diversity of viewpoints being expressed there. Sometimes I think that people use the phrase diversity of viewpoints to mean, do you have liberal and do you have Republican or conservative? I think that's a very binary way to look at it. I think that diversity in thought and diversity in perspective comes with diversity in experience, in backgrounds, in majors, in areas of interest, in how we communicate and how we perceive the world around us. And that's, outside politics, that's just human nature. And so I think what a newspaper should always strive to do is accurately represent its community and the voices within its community. And if you don't have diversity of thought, then you're not doing a very good job of that. So I would argue that different ways in which we try to sort of engender that diversity of perspective and thought is being very thoughtful about our outreach efforts, thinking about what are the best spaces to engage the most students, thinking about even just, simple things like listservs Are you reaching out to all majors, or are you reaching out to communication and English majors? It sounds so small, but it kind of starts there, right? Who are we including? Who are we advertising to? In our community engagement efforts, who are we aiming to include in this conversation? The answer, hopefully, is everyone. But so I would say that it is super important, and it really does come down to community engagement and community outreach, and thoughtfully engaging in those activities to make sure that a diversity of perspectives, viewpoints, backgrounds are all in play. Because, you know, even just looking at like the sections within a newspaper, I can tell you I can do news and I can do opinion. I couldn't do sports. I couldn't do, you know, science reporting. That is so far out of my realm. But I will tell you, I have some amazing environmental science majors and bio majors who are so much better at that stuff than I could ever aspire to be at any age, at any point in time of my life. It is important. And I think it starts with that community engagement and with that community outreach.
Christopher.
I think that in terms of our hiring, in terms of like how we approach a hiring diverse set of opinions, we inherently believe that, you know, there's a lot of truth to the fact that the more, you know, diverse your staff is based off of background and their identity, inherently you're going to have different perspectives, right? We're inviting different perspectives. We think that right now, because of the issues that I mentioned earlier, that we feel a little bit out of touch with our student body, that, you know, De La Cal has a staffing problem, right? The vast majority of our staff is Asian and white. And so as a result, we are, you know, not necessarily representing Latinx voices. We're not necessarily representing Black voices or Indigenous voices on campus either. As hiring manager, I saw this issue happen where we had, like, you know, only 12% of our applicant pool was Latinx identifying, and then only 6% of our acceptance pool was Latinx identifying. So it's like there's a discrepancy there, right? But also at the same time, in terms of, you know, if we're going down this road of like diversity of thought rather than diversity of identity, I can give you an example of someone that is on the editorial board who used to have, you know, conservative views. Me. I used to have conservative views when I joined the paper. I had a lot of conservative views when I joined the paper. You know, those views have since changed since working at the paper and going through education at UC Berkeley. But
it happens.
Yeah, it happens, right, when you go through college. You know, that's just like, it's an example of like someone who, you know, who came into the paper with conservative views. Our paper doesn't discriminate against these people in terms of hiring. Our hiring is very much based off of, can you write? And also, you know, can you, do you have talent in terms of reporting? And also, we do have a section for, like, you know, marginalized voices, and say that we take that into account too. But ultimately, at the end of the day, we really care about, can you write, can you learn, and can you dedicate yourself to the paper? And I think that that opens itself up to conservative members of the community to apply to the De La Cal too. One department that I know of in the De La Cal, who I think tends to be a little bit more conservative than the other departments, is a sports department. I think that by virtue of like the nature of that kind of reporting, it does tend to draw people with more conservative viewpoints to the sports department. And the sports department is a department that we really love. You know, at the end of the day, you know, we understand that students have different perspectives and we welcome those different perspectives. But at the same time, you know, we also, you know, will say that there is a line to be drawn in terms of how much you like, you know, put that perspective into your reporting, but also how you treat your coworkers, right? If you're conservative, that's totally fine, but you can't just, you know, in the extreme case, right? You can't just be going off and, like, you know, making fun of other people for their racial identity at work, right? That's totally not okay. But that's like the extreme perspective, right? As long as you keep a sense of professionalism about your identity and about your reporting, we welcome you to join the De La Cal, and we're happy to have you, right?
So I want to go, because we only have about 10 minutes left, amazingly. It flies by, but I want to go to some of the questions that we have from the viewers here. And I'm going to start with Ethan's question. How do you navigate politicized coverage in a time that is so polarized? Do you listen carefully to everyone, or do you need to insulate yourself?
So I'll start by saying Ethan is a close friend. So thank you, Ethan, for submitting that question. And thank you for coming and watching this. It's a great question. And I think it really does come back to some of the things that we've been talking about already. Navigating politicized coverage in a time that is polarizing. It depends on the political issue is the first thing that I'm going to say. It really does. If we're talking in a collegiate atmosphere, I think something we learn very quickly is that the personal is political and the political is personal. Things that we would consider, topics of debate are things that impact people's daily lives. And I think that something that I'd like all of our editors and our reporters to know off the bat is that, right? It's charging yourself with empathy in order to go into these spaces and take on these extremely polarizing issues. Like I said, in terms of navigating politicized coverage, I think a large portion of that is research. Oh my God, research, so much research. Read the bills, listen to everything everyone locally has to say about this specific political issue, whether it's a local political issue or a national political issue. You have to do your research, because you can go into interviews and be very easily persuaded by someone who's just very articulate, right? So the first thing is conducting your own independent research and being very well informed as you enter that topic. I also think you need to ask yourself, I think you need to be selective about your sources, is how I'm going to say that. I think it's really easy to find the loudest voice and cater to what they have to say. I think it takes a lot more work to actively be thinking about who is the foremost expert in this, who is going to give me a valuable perspective, and who am I just using for clickbait. I think a previous panel touched on this, was that whenever we see instances of really vitriolic speech, the coverage of that is amplified in comparison to people who aren't engaging in such methodologies. And so I think it comes down to research and being thoughtful about who you're choosing, to whose voices you're amplifying, whose perspectives you're amplifying, what are they the expert of, being very critical about how we are explaining these political issues as journalists, but also the voices and stories we're amplifying in order to provide insights. I think it really just comes down to, I hate to say it so plainly, but being a good journalist. I think those are really skills intrinsic to a good journalist. And I think if they're employed in the proper settings, especially in polarizing, politicized coverage, I think you're off to a great start.
Christopher, I'm going to turn to you with a question from anonymous attendee. And I don't know if the same anonymous attendee has posted all of these questions or if it's different anonymous attendees, but I'm going to go with the one, I'm going to sort of paraphrase one.
Sure.
And anonymous attendee writes, I'm hearing a fair amount of feeling that classic journalistic objectivity is outdated and impossible. And the question that I want to ask, there are a bunch of questions in here, but I think the one I want you to address is, how does the press keep their legitimacy without having a clear standard of objectivity to aspire to?
I think that, Summer can actually touch on this a little bit, but there are issues with libel, first of all, if you don't reach out to both sides, right? And I think that, if we continue with this idea that there is this platonic form of journalistic objectivity, which sure, I'll agree with you that there is a platonic form of this, ethereal sense of perfect objectivity for newsrooms. I think that it must be a balance between that and also how do you uplift marginalized voices? Because I think that the more that you, try to, if you aspire too heavily towards the former, then you end up doing things that aren't necessarily correct. Like what Atmika said earlier, right? If you're going to cover climate change studies that Berkeley has published, it's not a great idea to be reaching out to climate deniers and asking them about like, oh, like why is this study like BS or something like that, right? I think that there comes a time where you need to like draw a line between like, you know, what is like objective reality and also what is objective in terms of reporting, because we know that in the case of climate change, climate denial isn't exactly objective reality. But in the case of objective reporting, you would probably reach out to the others, like perfect objective reporting, you would reach out to the other side and ask them about climate denial, right? But I think that, you know, the reason why I stated what I said earlier, that we should try to move away from this platonic form, is because I think that it does harm in the sense that it forces us to reach out to other sides when reaching out to other sides isn't necessarily the best idea. If reaching out to other sides, it's necessarily going to be uplifting voices that, you know, spread hate or spread misinformation or stuff like that. There are senses of an objective reality. And the question is, how do we, you know, present an objective reality while also representing both sides of the aisle in terms of opinion as well, without also, you know, delving into hate and vitriol, and also uplifting marginalized voices. There's a lot of different moving parts there. And I don't think that it's simply like, you know, on one end, we're just like totally editorializing everything that we're saying, right? And on the other end is, you know, perfect objective reality. I think that putting it as a black and white picture doesn't, like as a linear, you know, sort of one-dimensional scale isn't necessarily a good idea. It's a much more complex issue, and you know how we navigate this sort of three-dimensional or four-dimensional playing field is much more complex than, like, you know, boiling it down to just like that kind of a dichotomy, I think.
And I'm just going to chime in as someone who is outside of the student journalism space by a little bit of time. We're still struggling with it in professional newsrooms every single day. You know, how do you find truth and fairness while not elevating things that are not true? I mean, it's like an ongoing challenge for our industry at all levels. Just to close out, we have a question from Jenny, and then so let's keep our answers quick because we don't have a lot of time. And Somer, I would love to hear your thought on this too. The question is, I'm curious to hear about whether this panel believes that there is a free speech crisis on university and college campuses.
Oops, sorry, couldn't find the unmute button there. I think this is a phrase that we're hearing sort of a lot, sort of like one of these, I guess, buzz words or buzz phrases. I think it depends. So to keep the answer short, I think it depends sort of on how you're using the phrase, right? I think that the way I see it being used a lot of times is sort of this idea that we have to give sort of equal, I don't know, talking time and equal attention, again, to all points of view and all sides. And so I don't know if I would consider that necessarily, excuse me, a free speech crisis, as it is that we see people being uncomfortable with the idea of journalists, whether it's student journalists or commercial journalists, sort of not sitting back and just blindly covering every point of view. I think that's more what I would say. And again, it depends on how you're using the phrase, but that's kind of how I see it.
Christopher and Mika, would you like to weigh in on whether there's a free speech crisis on campus before we close it out?
Go ahead, Mika.
Yeah, I think both Christopher and I have talked about instances of speech in hateful and problematic ways that I think really counters this idea that there's a free speech crisis. I'd argue that there are too many people who don't know the consequences to their own speech. That might really be the crisis right now. No, I don't think there is a free speech crisis. I think there is a crisis about understanding how to appropriately engage in free speech, right? Like the classic idea that just because speech is free doesn't mean that free speech doesn't have consequences. And I think it's recognizing our role in creating a part of those consequences and looking to be better and do better. I would say there's no shortage of free speech. Sometimes it's a little bit concerning how comfortable people are expressing certain things. I'm going to, again, point to the two instances both Christopher and I delved into in the beginning. But yeah, I think it's a very short-sighted argument to say that there is a free speech crisis. I think we as human beings are learning how to do better, and I'm incredibly proud of us for engaging in that task.
Christopher, any final words before I give it to Michelle?
Yeah, I'd second what Ethmika said. I think that, labeling it as like a free speech crisis is kind of clickbaity, in the sense that like all you're doing is you're trying to make it seem like there's a bigger problem than it actually is. I think that, there is a struggle to, how do you balance like objective reporting? How do you balance uplifting marginalized voices and DEI? And how do you balance, conservative speakers coming to campus? That's the whole reason why we're having this panel, right? There is a struggle to have that kind of a balance, but it's not a crisis, right? You don't have, it's like, I seriously think that labeling it as a crisis only necessarily serves to, inflame the passions of other people, and that doing so necessarily pushes people away from each other. I think there was the previous panel was talking about like, how we see the other side as like, stupid, or that we hate the other side. We tend to like label the other side as like uneducated and uninformed, but by purposefully labeling it as a free speech crisis, you are necessarily pushing the responsibility onto the other side and saying that you guys are the ones who are causing this, free speech crisis on our college university campuses. And therefore, you guys are just, attacking free speech. You guys are attacking education on college campuses. And I don't think that's productive, right? As Ethmika said, we're all like going through this process of learning how to navigate these spaces. And that is important. And that process of navigating the spaces is inherently educational. And that itself should not be labeled as a crisis. If you think that it's a crisis, I invite you to have a dialogue with us and sit down and talk with us, rather than just, spouting off and, labeling it as a crisis.
This has been terrific. Christopher Yang from the Daily Cal, Ethmika Ayer from the Daily Nexus, and Somer Ingram Dean, a staff attorney at the Student Press Law Center. Thank you so much for this.
I want to thank all of you, and especially Tamara for moderating and the three panelists. And someone just wrote in the Q&A what I was about to say, which is the future is in good hands with these two thoughtful and articulate students. So journalism is on the up and up, and I'm happy to end on that sort of hopeful note. I think it has been, obviously I'm not, we talked about objectivity. Clearly I'm not objective about this conference, but I think it was incredibly insightful and interesting. And for those of you that are new to the center, please subscribe to our mailing list so you can receive information about our programs and resources. This conference actually marks the 1-year anniversary of the birth of our center podcast, Speech Matters. Next Wednesday, look for episode 3, featuring international lawyer and scholar David Kay, one of UC's own. The center offers its resources, research, and programs like today's conference free of cost in order to be accessible. In keeping with the mission of the University of California, knowledge should be shared. If you learned something new today, had your viewpoints challenged, or just enjoyed yourself, please consider making a contribution, even if it's a very small one, to the center. Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you soon.